The water turned crimson as my 8-year-old brother Ethan thrashed helplessly in the Great White Shark Observatory tank, while my stepmother Victoria stood frozen with what looked like relief rather than horror on her perfectly painted face. What she didn't know was that 24 hours later, I would own the entire Pacific Marine Enterprises Corporation, and the security footage would reveal exactly what kind of accident this really was. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Zara Blackwood, and this is the story of how a family empire built on wonder became a weapon of betrayal, until the ocean itself delivered justice in ways none of us saw coming. The fog rolled in thick that Tuesday morning, the kind that makes Monterey Bay look like a ghost town wrapped in silver gauze. I should have taken it as an omen. Instead, I was focused on the excitement bubbling in my chest as I walked through the employee entrance of the Blackwood Oceanarium, the crown jewel of our family's marine entertainment empire. The familiar scent of salt water and the distant sound of sea lions barking always felt like coming home, even though technically, I hadn't worked here in 3 months. Victoria had made sure of that. But today was different. Today was Ethan's birthday, and even my stepmother couldn't deny him his one wish to have his big sister give him a private tour of the sharks. At 8 years old, Ethan was obsessed with marine life in a way that reminded everyone of our father, Richard Blackwood, who had built Pacific Marine Enterprises from a single roadside aquarium into a $50 million empire before his sudden death 2 years ago. I found them waiting by the main information desk, Victoria checking her diamond-encrusted watch with practiced impatience, while Ethan bounced on his toes, clutching a stuffed hammerhead shark that had seen better days. The contrast between them always struck me as almost comical if it weren't so telling. Victoria, immaculate in her cream-colored Chanel suit and heels that cost more than most people's rent, looked like she belonged in a boardroom or country club, not surrounded by the controlled chaos of families with sticky-fingered children pointing at jellyfish. Ethan, with his unruly dark hair and eyes that sparkled with genuine curiosity, belonged here in every way that mattered. "Zara!" Ethan launched himself at me, and I caught him in a hug that smelled like birthday pancakes and enthusiasm. "You're really gonna show me the big sharks, right? The really, really big ones?" "The biggest ones we have, birthday boy," I promised, ruffling his hair. Over his head, I caught Victoria's gaze. Her smile was as perfectly applied as her lipstick, but it never quite reached her green eyes. "How generous of you to make time," she said, her tone carrying that particular blend of sweetness and ice that she'd perfected since marrying into our family 5 years ago. "I know how busy you must be with your new endeavors." "My new endeavors." That was Victoria's polite way of referring to the fact that I'd been systematically pushed out of every meaningful role at Pacific Marine Enterprises since our father died. First, my position as Director of Marine Education was restructured into something that required an MBA I didn't have. Then my access to board meetings was revoked because I wasn't an official board member, despite having grown up in these halls and knowing more about marine life than half the suits who made decisions about our animals' welfare. Finally, my keycard access was limited to public areas only, for security purposes, Victoria had explained with that same cold smile. I was a Blackwood by blood, but according to Victoria, that no longer came with the privileges I'd grown up taking for granted. "I always have time for family," I replied, keeping my voice light for Ethan's sake. "Especially on birthdays." Victoria's expression flickered, just for a moment, something crossing her features that I couldn't quite read. Then the mask was back in place. "Of course. Family first, as Richard always said." The way she invoked our father's name still made my stomach clench. Richard Blackwood had been many things: driven entrepreneur, passionate conservationist, demanding perfectionist, but above all, he'd been a man who believed in legacy. He'd built Pacific Marine Enterprises not just as a business, but as a bridge between the mysterious world beneath the waves and the millions of people who would never otherwise experience its wonder. Every decision he made was filtered through a simple question: will this help people fall in love with the ocean the way I did? Victoria's decisions seemed to be filtered through a different question entirely. Will this increase profit margins? We started our tour in the kelp forest exhibit, where towering artificial kelp swayed in carefully engineered currents, while leopard sharks glided between the fronds like living shadows. Ethan pressed his face against the viewing window, his breath fogging the glass as he pointed excitedly at a particularly large shark weaving through the vegetation. "That one's at least 6 feet long," he announced with the confidence of someone who'd been measuring sharks in picture books since he could read. "Do you think he's the boss of all the other sharks?" "Actually," I said, crouching down beside him, "leopard sharks are pretty peaceful. They're more interested in finding crabs and fish to eat than being the boss of anyone. The ocean's not really about being the biggest or the strongest, it's about finding your place in the ecosystem. Like how the cleaner fish help the bigger fish stay healthy." Ethan asked, his face lighting up with understanding. "Exactly like that. Everyone has a role to play." Victoria, who had been checking her phone instead of watching the sharks, looked up sharply. "What a lovely sentiment," she said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but lovely. "Though I suppose in the real world, someone does have to be in charge. Someone has to make the difficult decisions that keep everything running smoothly." The comment felt loaded with meaning that went beyond marine biology, but before I could respond, Ethan was already tugging on my hand, eager to move on to the next exhibit. We wound our way through the colorful chaos of the tropical reef display, past the ethereal moon jellies drifting like living snow globes, and into the deeper, more dramatic waters of the open ocean exhibit. This was where the real predators lived. The Great White Shark Observatory was the crown jewel of the Blackwood Oceanarium, a massive circular tank that rose 2 stories high and held over 1 million gallons of carefully maintained seawater. 3 adult great whites, each over 12 feet long, patrolled the space with the casual confidence of apex predators. The viewing area was designed like an amphitheater, with tiered seating that allowed visitors to observe the sharks from multiple angles. But the most impressive feature was the glass tunnel that ran directly through the center of the tank. Walking through that tunnel was like stepping into another world entirely. Above, below, and on all sides, the great whites moved through the blue-tinted water with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. It was humbling and terrifying and absolutely magnificent, exactly the kind of experience our father had envisioned when he'd insisted on building this exhibit, despite the enormous cost and complexity. Ethan's eyes went wide as we entered the viewing area. Even Victoria seemed momentarily impressed, though she quickly returned her attention to her phone. The morning crowd was light, just a few early visitors scattered throughout the amphitheater seating, which meant we had the tunnel mostly to ourselves. "This is incredible," Ethan breathed, pressing his hands against the curved glass as a massive female great white cruised past, so close we could see the individual serrations on her teeth. "She's beautiful." "That's Catalina," I told him, feeling a familiar surge of pride and affection as I watched the shark's effortless movement through the water. "She's been with us for 3 years now. She was rescued after getting tangled in fishing nets off the Channel Islands." "Does she remember being hurt?" Ethan asked, the question carrying a weight that seemed too heavy for an 8-year-old's shoulders. "I don't think sharks remember things the way we do," I said carefully, "but she's safe here, and she's healthy, and she gets to help thousands of people understand how amazing sharks really are, instead of just being afraid of them." Victoria snorted softly. "Afraid of them seems like the appropriate response, considering they're literally designed to kill things." "They're designed to be perfect predators," I corrected, trying to keep the irritation out of my voice. "That doesn't make them evil, it makes them essential. Without sharks, entire ocean ecosystems would collapse." "How philosophical," Victoria said, finally looking up from her phone.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Though I suppose when you're not responsible for actually running a business, it's easy to get sentimental about the merchandise. The word, merchandise, hit me like a physical blow. These weren't merchandise. They were living creatures, each with their own personality and needs and role in the complex web of life that our father had dedicated his career to protecting and sharing. But before I could formulate a response that wouldn't traumatize Ethan, my little brother had wandered toward the edge of the tunnel where it connected to the upper observation deck. The design was ingenious, allowing visitors to move seamlessly from the underwater viewing experience to an elevated platform where they could see the surface of the tank and watch the sharks from above. The platform was surrounded by a safety barrier, of course, but it was designed to be unobtrusive, just high enough to prevent accidents while maintaining the illusion of being right at the water's edge. Ethan climbed onto one of the observation benches, standing on his tiptoes to get a better view of the surface. "Look, Zara, you can see their fins when they come up." I moved toward him automatically, the same protective instinct that had made me the designated big sister for the past 8 years. "Careful, buddy. Those benches can be slippery." But Victoria was closer, and she reached Ethan first. "Here, sweetheart," she said, her voice honey-sweet as she placed her hands on his shoulders. "Let me help you see better." What happened next unfolded in slow motion, each second stretching like taffy, while my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. Victoria's hands on Ethan's shoulders, steadying him at first, then shifting, her grip changing from protective to something else entirely. Ethan focused completely on the sharks below, unaware of anything except his 8-year-old wonder at the magnificent creatures moving through the water. And then Victoria's hands weren't steadying him anymore. They were pushing. It was subtle, barely perceptible, the kind of movement that could easily be explained as an accident, a momentary loss of balance, a tragic mishap that no one could have prevented. But I saw it. I saw the deliberate shift in her posture, the way her fingers pressed against Ethan's small back, the calculated look in her eyes as she applied just enough pressure to send him tumbling forward over the safety barrier. Ethan's scream cut through the ambient sound of water pumps and distant conversations like a knife through silk. The splash that followed seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence that descended over the observation area. Other visitors rushed toward the barrier, pointing and shouting, but their voices sounded muffled and far away, like they were coming from underwater. My little brother was in the shark tank, thrashing desperately in the 1,000,000 gallons of salt water, while 3 12-foot great whites circled below him like living nightmares. His stuffed hammerhead shark bobbed on the surface nearby, a cruel reminder of his innocent excitement just moments before. I moved without thinking, my marine biology training overriding the panic that threatened to paralyze me. The emergency procedures our father had drilled into every employee were burned into my muscle memory. Alert security, activate the emergency response system, clear the area, wait for the professional rescue team. But professional rescue teams took time. And Ethan didn't have time. The water was already turning pink. Victoria stood frozen by the safety barrier, her face a mask of perfectly performed shock and horror. "Oh my God," she gasped, her hand pressed to her chest in a gesture that would have looked convincing to anyone who hadn't seen what I'd seen. It happened so fast. He just lost his balance and fell. Oh my God, poor Ethan. But her eyes told a different story. In the split second before she realized I was watching her, before she remembered to look devastated, I saw something in her expression that made my blood run cold. Relief. Security arrived within minutes, followed by the emergency response team and paramedics. They pulled Ethan from the water unconscious but alive, the shallow cuts on his arms and legs testament to how close he'd come to something far worse. The sharks, disturbed by the commotion and the unfamiliar presence in their domain, had circled but not attacked, a small miracle that probably had more to do with the fact that they'd been well fed that morning than any inherent reluctance to harm a child. As they loaded Ethan into the ambulance, Victoria played the role of the devastated stepmother to perfection. She rode with him to the hospital, clutching his hand and whispering apologies for not being able to prevent the accident. The paramedics praised her quick thinking in calling for help. The security guards assured her that these things happen. that the safety measures are designed to prevent exactly this kind of tragic mishap, but sometimes children are just too quick and curious for their own good. No one questioned her version of events. No one thought to wonder whether the accident might not have been an accident at all, except me. I stayed behind to give my statement to the security team and help coordinate with the media relations department. Pacific Marine Enterprises had weathered public relations crises before, but a child falling into the shark tank was exactly the kind of story that could destroy everything our father had built if it wasn't handled carefully. Victoria, despite her apparent emotional state, had already called our corporate attorneys from the ambulance, ensuring that the response would be swift and comprehensive. It was almost as if she'd been prepared for this exact scenario. The rest of the day passed in a blur of incident reports and damage control. Ethan was stable but sedated, with 15 stitches in his left arm and a concussion that would keep him in the hospital for observation. Victoria maintained her vigil at his bedside, accepting sympathy and support from friends and colleagues who praised her strength in the face of such a traumatic experience. I tried to visit that evening, but Victoria gently turned me away. "He needs rest," she said, her voice thick with exhaustion and concern. "The doctors say too much stimulation could be harmful right now. Maybe tomorrow, when he's stronger." It was reasonable, it was caring. It was exactly what any responsible guardian would say under the circumstances. But as I walked back to my car in the hospital parking garage, I couldn't shake the image of Victoria's hands on Ethan's shoulders. The deliberate shift in her posture, the momentary flash of relief in her eyes before she remembered to look horrified. The parking garage was dimly lit and mostly empty, the kind of place where thoughts echo louder than footsteps. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the concrete wall in front of me while pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve began clicking into place. Ethan was the heir to Pacific Marine Enterprises. Not Victoria, despite her position as Richard's widow. Not me, despite my knowledge and passion for the family business. Our father's will had been very specific about that. When Ethan turned 18, he would inherit controlling interest in the company, with provisions for his education and care managed by a trust until then. Victoria was the trustee, of course. She controlled the company until Ethan came of age, but she didn't own it. She was a steward, not an heir. Unless something happened to Ethan. In that case, according to the complex legal documents our father had crafted with the help of the best estate attorneys money could buy, control of Pacific Marine Enterprises would pass to the next blood relative, which was me. But if something happened to both of us, if some terrible accident or tragedy befell both Blackwood children, then Victoria, as Richard's surviving spouse, would inherit everything. $50 million was a lot of money, more than enough to motivate someone to turn a family outing into something far more sinister. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Dr. Marcus Reed had been our father's closest friend and confidant, a marine biologist who'd helped design many of the educational programs that made our aquariums more than just entertainment venues. He'd also been like an uncle to Ethan and me, the kind of man who remembered birthdays and graduation dates and never missed an opportunity to share his latest research discoveries. If anyone would listen to my suspicions without immediately dismissing them as grief-induced paranoia, it would be Marcus. "Zara?" His voice was warm despite the late hour. "I heard about what happened today. How's Ethan doing?" "He's alive," I said, and then immediately wondered why I'd phrased it that way. "He's stable. Banged up, but stable. Thank God for that. I can't imagine how terrifying it must have been for you and Victoria. These accidents, they happened so fast." "Marcus," I said, taking a deep breath. "I don't think it was an accident." The silence that followed stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Then Marcus spoke, his voice carefully neutral. "What do you mean?" So I told him. Everything. What I'd seen, what I'd noticed. The way Victoria's reaction had seemed just slightly off, in ways that made sense only in retrospect. I talked about the will, about the inheritance, about the fact that Ethan's death would ultimately benefit Victoria in ways that his survival never could. When I finished, Marcus was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "Zara, I understand that you're upset. Traumatic experiences can make us see patterns that aren't there, connections that feel meaningful but don't actually exist. Are you sure you're not reading more into this than is actually there?" It was a reasonable question, a fair question. The kind of question any rational person would ask when presented with what sounded like a conspiracy theory built on hunches and suspicion. But I'd been watching Victoria for 5 years. I'd seen how she operated, how she smiled and charmed and manipulated her way through every interaction. I'd watched her systematically isolate me from the family business, removing my influence piece by piece until I was barely more than a visitor in the company my father had built. And I'd seen her push my little brother into a tank full of sharks. "I'm sure," I said. Marcus sighed. "Even if you're right, and I'm not saying you are, what do you propose to do about it? You don't have any proof." Security cameras would show exactly what everyone else saw, a tragic accident that happened too quickly for anyone to prevent. He was right, of course. The security footage would show Ethan losing his balance and falling, with Victoria reaching out too late to catch him. It would look like exactly what she claimed it was, a terrible accident that no one could have predicted or prevented, unless there were other cameras. Angles that security hadn't thought to check, footage that might show the subtle details that made the difference between accident and attempted murder. "Marcus," I said, "I need a favor." The next morning, I called in sick to my job at the Marine Research Institute, where I'd been working since being pushed out of the family business. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did feel sick, nauseated by suspicion and anger, and the growing certainty that Victoria had tried to kill my brother. Instead of going to work, I drove back to the Blackwood Oceanarium. The Great White Shark Observatory was closed for routine maintenance, a euphemistic way of saying that they needed time to repair any damage caused by Ethan's fall and ensure that all safety measures were functioning properly. The exhibit would reopen in a few days, probably with additional safety features that would prevent any similar accidents in the future. I used my limited access keycard to enter through the employee entrance, hoping that Victoria hadn't thought to revoke what little access I still had. The card worked, and I made my way through the familiar corridors toward the shark exhibit, trying to look like I belonged there despite the fact that I probably didn't anymore. Marcus was waiting for me by the main entrance to the observatory, holding a tablet and wearing the kind of expression that suggested he thought this was a terrible idea but was willing to go along with it anyway. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told me without preamble, "about the cameras and the angles. You might be right that the main security footage won't show what you think you saw, but there are other recording devices in the exhibit area." He showed me the tablet, which displayed a schematic of the Great White Shark Observatory with various monitoring points marked in different colors. The sharks are monitored constantly for behavioral studies and health assessments. There are cameras positioned throughout the tank and viewing area that aren't part of the standard security system. They're designed to track the animals, not the visitors, but they might have captured what happened yesterday from a different perspective. My heart started beating faster. "Can you access that footage?" "I can try. The monitoring system is managed by the research department, and I still have administrative privileges." Marcus looked uncomfortable, but determined. "If there's something to find, we'll find it." We made our way to the research station located behind the main exhibit area, a cramped space filled with computers and monitoring equipment that tracked everything from water temperature to shark movement patterns. Marcus sat down at one of the workstations and began typing, his fingers moving with the confidence of someone who'd used these systems hundreds of times before. "Here," he said after several minutes of scrolling through files and timestamps. "Yesterday, 10:47 a.m. That should be right around when it happened." The footage was different from what I'd expected. Instead of the clear, well-lit security camera angles I was used to seeing, these were underwater shots from cameras designed to track marine life. The perspective was strange, looking up from the bottom of the tank toward the surface, where human shapes moved like shadows against the bright lights above. But there was also footage from the behavioral monitoring cameras positioned around the viewing area, designed to observe how visitors interacted with the exhibit. These cameras weren't focused on security. They were studying human behavior as part of ongoing research into educational effectiveness and visitor engagement, which meant they captured details that security cameras might miss. Marcus found the right timestamp and hit play. On the screen, I watched yesterday's events unfold from a completely different angle. There was Ethan, climbing onto the observation bench with the enthusiasm of a child who'd been looking forward to this moment all morning. There was me, moving toward him with protective instincts that had become second nature over the past 8 years. And there was Victoria, reaching him first, placing her hands on his shoulders in what looked like a helpful, stabilizing gesture. Until it wasn't. The behavioral monitoring camera captured it perfectly. The subtle shift in Victoria's posture, the way her hands changed position, the deliberate pressure she applied to Ethan's back. It happened quickly, just a few seconds of movement that would be easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But once you knew what to look for, it was unmistakable. Victoria had pushed Ethan into the shark tank. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, staring at the screen. "You were right." I felt vindicated and horrified at the same time. Part of me had been hoping I was wrong, that my suspicions were just the product of stress and family tension, and too many years of watching Victoria manipulate her way through every situation. Finding proof meant that my worst fears were justified, but it also meant that my 8-year-old brother was living with a woman who had tried to murder him. "We need to copy this footage," I said, "and we need to call the police." Marcus nodded, already reaching for a portable drive. "I'll make multiple copies, and I think you should call Helena Cross." Helena Cross was the family attorney who'd handled our father's estate planning and had been trying to navigate the complex legal situation surrounding Pacific Marine Enterprises since his death. She was smart, discreet, and most importantly, she understood the financial implications of what we'd discovered. While Marcus copied the footage, I stepped outside to make the call. Helena answered on the second ring, her voice crisp with professional efficiency. "Zara, I heard about the accident. How is Ethan?" "It wasn't an accident," I said, and then explained everything we'd found. Helena listened without interruption, asking only a few clarifying questions about the footage and the timeline. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "This is serious," she said finally. "If what you're telling me is true, we're talking about attempted murder and fraud. But we need to be very careful about how we proceed. Victoria has significant resources and legal representation, and she's currently positioned as the victim's guardian. Any accusations we make need to be backed up by ironclad evidence. We have the footage. That's a start, but we'll need more. Financial records, communication logs, anything that might establish motive and premeditation. And we need to ensure Ethan's safety while we build the case." I thought about my little brother lying in a hospital bed while Victoria maintained her vigil beside him, playing the role of the caring stepmother while planning who knew what next move. The thought made my stomach clench with anxiety and rage. "What do we do?" I asked. "First, we secure that footage with multiple copies in different locations. Then we start investigating Victoria's financial situation, her communications, her activities leading up to the incident. And we need to find a way to limit her access to Ethan until we can prove what she's done." It felt like an impossible task. Victoria controlled the trust, the company, and had legal guardianship over Ethan. She had resources and connections that I couldn't match, and she'd already proven that she was willing to kill to protect her position. But I had something she didn't expect. The truth, captured in digital footage that would be very difficult to explain away. And I had time to find more evidence, because Victoria thought she'd gotten away with it. Marcus emerged from the research station with 3 copies of the footage, each stored on a separate encrypted drive. "I've also pulled all the related behavioral data from that day," he said. "Visitor patterns, interaction logs, timing analyses. If there's anything else unusual about yesterday, it should show up in the data." I took one of the drives and slipped it into my bag, feeling its weight like a loaded gun. Evidence of attempted murder, stored in a device smaller than a credit card. It was strange how something so small could have the power to destroy someone's carefully constructed life. We parted ways in the parking lot, Marcus heading back to his lab to analyze the behavioral data while I drove toward the hospital. Visiting hours wouldn't start for another few hours, but I wanted to be there, wanted to see Ethan for myself and make sure he was really okay. I also wanted to watch Victoria, to observe her behavior now that I knew what she was capable of. The hospital parking garage was the same concrete maze it had been the night before, but everything felt different now. I wasn't just a worried sister anymore. I was someone who knew the truth, someone who carried evidence of a crime that most people would refuse to believe. The weight of that knowledge sat heavy in my chest as I made my way toward the elevator, planning my next move in a game where the stakes were my brother's life and a $50 million empire built on wonder and betrayal. Victoria didn't know it yet, but the accident she'd so carefully orchestrated was about to become the evidence that brought her down. The ocean, after all, has a way of revealing its secrets to those who know how to look beneath the surface. The hospital corridor smelled like antiseptic and false hope, a combination that made my skin crawl as I approached Ethan's room. Through the small window in the door, I could see Victoria sitting beside his bed, her posture perfect even in exhaustion, one manicured hand resting gently on his blanket while she scrolled through her phone with the other. She looked like a magazine photograph titled, "Devoted Stepmother Maintains Vigil," and I wondered how many of the nurses had already commented on her dedication. A different nurse than the one from yesterday approached me with a sympathetic smile. "Are you family? The little boy's been asking for his sister." "I'm his sister," I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "Zara Blackwood." Her expression brightened with recognition. "Oh, wonderful. He's been talking about you non-stop. Mrs. Sterling said you might visit today." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between you and me, I think having his big sister here might do more good than all our medicine combined." I thanked her and pushed open the door, bracing myself for the performance I knew Victoria would put on. But the moment I saw Ethan propped up against his pillows, his left arm wrapped in white bandages and a purple bruise spreading across his temple, the careful composure I'd been maintaining cracked. "Zara!" His face lit up despite the pain medication that made his voice sound thick and distant. "You came back?" I moved to the opposite side of the bed from Victoria, careful to keep my expression neutral, as I took his uninjured hand. "Of course I came back, buddy. How are you feeling?" "Weird," he said honestly. "The doctors say I hit my head pretty hard, but I remember everything. I remember falling, and the water being so cold, and how scary it was when I couldn't find the surface. But I also remember the sharks didn't hurt me. They just swam around like they were curious." Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "You were very brave, sweetheart. And very lucky." "The nurse said I might have a cool scar," Ethan continued, oblivious to the tension in the room. "Like a real marine biologist who got in a fight with a shark and won." "Marine biologists try very hard not to fight with sharks," I said gently. "We respect them too much for that." "Is that why they didn't bite me? Because they knew I respected them?" The question was so innocent, so purely Ethan, that I had to swallow hard before answering. Maybe. Or maybe they were just well-fed and not interested in anything that wasn't their normal food. "Zara's always been full of interesting theories about animal behavior," Victoria said, her tone light but somehow cutting. "Though I suppose in a crisis, it's better to rely on facts than theories." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria was testing me, seeing if I would say anything about what I suspected, what I'd seen. She was confident that her version of events would stand, that my theories about animal behavior extended to theories about human behavior that no one would take seriously. She was wrong about that, but she didn't know it yet. "You're right," I said carefully. "Facts are important, especially when something doesn't add up." Victoria's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it with apparent relief. "I'm sorry, I need to take this. The insurance company has been calling non-stop about the incident report." She stood gracefully, smoothing her skirt. "I'll just be a few minutes." When she stepped into the hallway, I turned my full attention to Ethan. The medication made him more talkative than usual, his normal 8-year-old filter completely gone. "Zara," he said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a whisper. can I tell you something weird? Always. Right before I fell, Victoria was helping me see better, you know? She put her hands on my shoulders like this. He demonstrated with his uninjured arm, placing his hand on his own shoulder. But then it felt like she was pushing me forward instead of holding me steady. Like when we play that game where you pretend you're going to push someone in the pool but you don't actually do it? Except she did do it. My heart stopped. What do you mean, buddy? I don't think she meant to, he said quickly, clearly not wanting to get Victoria in trouble. I think maybe she just lost her balance too. And when she tried to catch herself, she accidentally pushed me instead. But for a second, it felt like she was trying to make me fall. I squeezed his hand gently, trying to keep my voice casual despite the fury building in my chest. That must have been scary, feeling like you were going to fall. Yeah, but the scariest part was seeing her face right before it happened. Ethan's voice got smaller. She looked really angry. Not at me, I don't think, but angry about something. And then right after I hit the water, when I was still trying to figure out which way was up, I heard her screaming for help. But it sounded different than when people are really scared. It sounded like when we practiced the fire drill at school and everyone knew it was just pretend. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Victoria hadn't just pushed him, she'd planned it. The angry expression Ethan had seen was frustration that her opportunity had finally arrived, and the screaming that followed was calculated performance designed to establish her as the victim of a tragic accident rather than its architect. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated an 8-year-old's ability to recognize when someone was lying to him. Ethan, I said carefully, has Victoria ever made you feel unsafe before? Even in small ways? He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers picking at the edge of his blanket. She's not mean or anything, he said finally, but sometimes she looks at me like I'm a math problem she can't solve. And she's always asking weird questions about Dad's will and when I'm going to be old enough to make my own decisions about the company. She says she's just planning for the future, but it feels like she's wishing I would hurry up and grow up so she doesn't have to take care of me anymore. What kind of questions? Like what happens if I don't want to run the aquariums when I'm older? Or what would happen to the company if something happened to me and you? She says it's important to have backup plans, but the way she asks makes it sound like she's hoping something will happen. I felt sick. Victoria had been probing Ethan about the inheritance structure, probably trying to figure out exactly how the succession would work if he were out of the picture. To an 8-year-old, it would seem like ordinary adult conversation about planning and responsibility. But from Victoria's perspective, it was reconnaissance. Ethan, I want you to know that no matter what happens, you're safe. I'm going to make sure of that. Are you going to tell Victoria what I said? Because I don't want her to be mad at me. She gets really quiet when she's mad, and that's scarier than yelling. The fact that my little brother was worried about protecting the feelings of a woman who'd tried to murder him made me want to punch something. Instead, I smoothed his hair back from his forehead and tried to project calm confidence. I won't tell her in a way that gets you in trouble. But Ethan, if you ever feel unsafe or scared, even a little bit, you call me immediately. Promise? Promise, he said solemnly. But Zara? I don't think it was an accident. The words hung between us like a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. My 8-year-old brother had reached the same conclusion I had, but from the perspective of the intended victim rather than an outside observer. He knew Victoria had tried to kill him, but he didn't understand why, and he was still childish enough to worry about getting her in trouble for it. Victoria returned a few minutes later, her phone tucked away and her concerned stepmother mask firmly back in place. Sorry about that. The insurance adjuster wants to schedule a site visit to review our safety protocols. She settled back into her chair. How are we doing? Better, I said. Ethan was just telling me about how well the nurses have been taking care of him. Everyone's been wonderful, Victoria agreed, though the doctor mentioned he'll probably be ready to come home tomorrow. I've already arranged for a private nurse to help with his recovery. The thought of Ethan alone in a house with Victoria, even with a nurse present, made my chest tighten with anxiety. But I couldn't object without revealing my suspicions, and I wasn't ready for that confrontation yet. That's great, I said instead. I'm sure he'll be more comfortable at home. Of course, you're welcome to visit anytime, Victoria said graciously. Family is so important during recovery. It was a perfectly reasonable thing to say, the kind of generous offer any caring stepmother would make, but I caught the subtle emphasis on the word, visit. The gentle reminder that I was no longer a permanent part of Ethan's daily life. I was being relegated to the role of occasional guest, someone who could be managed and controlled through scheduled interactions. That evening, I met Helena Cross at her office in downtown San Francisco. The law firm occupied an entire floor of a gleaming high-rise, all marble surfaces and carefully selected art that screamed expensive competence. Helena's corner office had a view of the bay that probably cost more per month than most people's salaries, but she'd earned her reputation as one of the city's most formidable estate attorneys. She reviewed the footage Marcus and I had collected with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining X-rays. Her expression remained professionally neutral throughout, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes when Victoria's hand shifted on Ethan's shoulders. "This is compelling evidence," she said finally, "but it's not going to be easy to prosecute. Defense attorneys will argue that the footage shows an accident, that any movement you're interpreting as deliberate could be explained as Victoria losing her balance or trying unsuccessfully to catch Ethan as he fell. What about Ethan's testimony? He remembers feeling like she pushed him. The testimony of an 8-year-old who suffered a head injury is going to be problematic in court. Defense will claim his memories are unreliable due to trauma and medication." Helena leaned back in her leather chair. "We need to establish motive and premeditation. Financial records, communication logs, anything that shows Victoria has been planning this. She's been systematically pushing me out of the company since Dad died. Maybe that's part of a larger plan. Possibly, but we need documentation. Email threads, recorded conversations, financial transactions that don't make sense. And we need to understand the complete structure of your father's estate planning." Helena pulled out a thick file that I recognized as our father's will and trust documents. "Let's review the succession plan. If something happens to Ethan, you inherit controlling interest in Pacific Marine Enterprises. If something happens to both of you, Victoria gets everything as the surviving spouse. So she benefits from Ethan's death, but benefits even more if we both die." "Exactly, which means you're also in danger." Helena's tone was matter-of-fact, but the words sent a chill down my spine. "Victoria has attempted to eliminate the primary heir. You're the only thing standing between her and complete control of a $50 million company." I thought about all the times over the past 2 years when I'd felt like Victoria was undermining me, isolating me from the family business and our social circle. I'd attributed it to typical step-family dynamics, the natural friction between a new spouse and adult stepchildren. But what if it had been something more calculated? "She's been documenting my supposed instability," I realized aloud. "The way I've been pushed out of company decisions, labeled as emotional and unreliable. If something happens to me now, she's already established a narrative that I was struggling with grief and resentment." "That's exactly the kind of premeditation we need to prove," Helena said. "Do you have access to any company communications? Email accounts, shared drives, meeting minutes?" "Some. I still have login credentials to a few systems from when I used to work there." I thought about the behavioral research files Marcus had mentioned, the detailed logs that tracked everything happening in and around the aquarium exhibits. And I might have access to more data than she realizes. Good. We need to move quickly, but we also need to be thorough. Victoria has significant resources and legal representation, and she's currently positioned as the victim of a terrible accident. Any accusations we make need to be absolutely bulletproof. I left Helena's office with a clear mission: gather evidence, document patterns, and build an unshakable case before Victoria realized what I was doing. But as I drove home through the fog-shrouded streets of San Francisco, I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Victoria had tried once and failed. She wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The next morning, I called in sick again and drove to the Marine Research Institute where I'd been working since being exiled from the family company. Dr. Sarah Patel, my supervisor, was understanding when I explained that I needed a few days to deal with a family emergency. She didn't pry into the details, which I appreciated since I wasn't sure how to explain that I was investigating my stepmother for attempted murder. Instead of going home, I drove to a coffee shop in Santa Cruz, where I could use the free Wi-Fi without worrying about network logs or digital surveillance. I opened my laptop and began the careful process of accessing Pacific Marine Enterprises' internal systems. My father had been meticulous about documentation, insisting that every decision, every policy change, every financial transaction be recorded and justified in writing. If you can't explain it in a memo, he used to say, you probably shouldn't be doing it. That philosophy had created a comprehensive digital paper trail that tracked the company's operations in exhaustive detail. I started with the financial records, looking for unusual transactions or changes in spending patterns since Victoria had taken control. What I found was systematic looting disguised as operational expenses, consulting fees paid to companies that didn't seem to exist, equipment purchases that were never delivered, marketing campaigns that produced no measurable results but somehow cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Victoria had been siphoning money from Pacific Marine Enterprises for months, probably building a war chest for whatever came after she eliminated the inconvenient heirs. But the financial fraud was just the beginning. I found email threads discussing my emotional instability and inappropriate attachment to company policies that prioritized animal welfare over profit margins. Victoria had been building a case for my incompetence, documenting instances where I'd objected to cost-cutting measures or questioned decisions that put our marine animals at risk. She'd been preparing to have me declared unfit to inherit long before she'd decided to try a more direct approach. The most damning evidence came from her communication with Gerald Ashford, the board member who'd become her closest ally since our father's death. Their email exchanges revealed a relationship that went far beyond professional collaboration. "The girl is becoming a problem," Victoria had written in one message dated just 3 weeks before Ethan's accident. "Her sentimental attachment to Richard's conservation policies is preventing us from maximizing profit potential. We need to accelerate our timeline." Gerald's response was equally revealing. "Patience. The trust structure protects her for now, but there are ways to work around family sentiment. The boy is the real obstacle. Until he comes of age, we're limited in our options." "Unless he doesn't come of age," Victoria had replied. "Accidents happen in environments with dangerous animals." I stared at the screen, my hands shaking as I read the words again. They'd been planning this for weeks, maybe longer. Victoria's attempt to kill Ethan wasn't a moment of desperate improvisation. It was the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan to eliminate the Blackwood heirs and take control of our father's empire. I took screenshots of everything, uploading the evidence to multiple cloud storage accounts and emailing copies to myself at 3 different addresses. If something happened to me, I wanted to make sure the truth wouldn't disappear with my laptop. But even as I gathered evidence of Victoria's crimes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. The plan revealed in her emails was too neat, too simple. Victoria was smart enough to know that killing both heirs in quick succession would raise suspicions. She had to have a more sophisticated strategy for eliminating me without drawing unwanted attention. The answer came to me as I was reviewing the behavioral monitoring data from the shark exhibit. Hidden among the routine tracking logs and visitor interaction studies, I found something that made my blood run cold. Someone had been studying my patterns, documenting my schedule, my habits, my regular visits to various parts of the aquarium complex. The data went back 6 months, tracking every time I'd used my access card, every location I'd visited, every interaction I'd had with staff members or exhibits. They'd been watching me, learning my routines, waiting for the perfect opportunity to stage my own accident. I was so absorbed in the data that I almost didn't notice the car that had been following me since I left the coffee shop. It was a black sedan with tinted windows, the kind of generic vehicle that was designed to be forgettable. But it had made the same 3 turns I had, maintaining a careful distance that suggested professional surveillance rather than coincidence. My mouth went dry as I realized what was happening. Victoria knew I was investigating. She'd probably known since the moment I started accessing company systems, since every login was logged and monitored. Instead of trying to stop me, she'd been watching, waiting to see what I would discover and how I would react. Now she knew that I had evidence of her crimes, and she was moving to the next phase of her plan. I pulled into the parking lot of a busy shopping center, hoping to lose the tail in the maze of afternoon shoppers and delivery trucks. But the black sedan followed, parking several spaces away where the driver could maintain visual contact without being obvious about it. I sat in my car for several minutes, trying to think clearly despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Going home was out of the question. They probably knew where I lived. Going to the police was risky without more evidence, especially since Victoria had positioned herself as the victim of Ethan's tragic accident. Even going to Helena's office might be dangerous if they were monitoring my movements. But I had one advantage they didn't know about: Marcus and his access to the research facilities at the aquarium. If I could get there without being followed, I might be able to find additional evidence, or at least secure what I'd already collected. I waited until a large delivery truck blocked the sedan's view, then quickly left my car and walked toward the main entrance of the shopping center. I went straight through to the opposite side, where I caught a rideshare to a location several miles away from my actual destination. It was a precaution my father had taught me years ago when discussing personal safety protocols for high-profile family members. Never go directly where you're actually going, he'd said. Make them guess, make them work for it. Information is power, and the less they know about your real intentions, the better your chances of staying ahead of them. An hour later, I was standing in Marcus's lab at the Marine Research Facility, watching him review the evidence I'd gathered while we waited for Helena to arrive with a court stenographer. The plan was simple: create an official record of everything we'd discovered, then present it to law enforcement with enough documentation to force an immediate investigation. But plans, as I was learning, rarely survived contact with people like Victoria Sterling. Marcus's phone rang just as we were preparing to begin the formal documentation process. He answered with a distracted greeting, then his expression shifted to alarm. "What do you mean, missing?" he said sharply. "When was the last time anyone saw him?" I knew before he even hung up. The cold certainty settled in my stomach like a stone dropped in deep water. "Ethan," Marcus said grimly. "He's gone. Victoria signed him out of the hospital this morning, hours before he was scheduled for discharge. The nurses assumed she'd gotten medical clearance, but when the doctor made rounds this afternoon, there was no record of early release authorization. Where did she take him?" "That's just it. Security footage shows them leaving together, but her car never made it to the house. Her housekeeper says she hasn't heard from Victoria since yesterday, and there's no answer at any of her usual numbers." I stared at Marcus, the implications crashing over me like a cold wave. Victoria had realized that her original plan had failed, that Ethan was talking about what he remembered from the incident, that I was gathering evidence that would eventually expose her crimes. So she'd moved to the simplest solution of all: eliminate the witnesses and disappear with whatever assets she could liquid before anyone could stop her. My 8-year-old brother was somewhere with a woman who'd already tried to kill him once, and this time, she had nothing left to lose. Helena arrived 20 minutes later with a court stenographer and a grim expression that suggested she'd already heard the news. "I've contacted the FBI," she said without preamble. "Child abduction across state lines is a federal crime, and we have enough evidence to suggest that Ethan is in immediate danger." "How long before they can act?" I asked. "They're already acting. But Victoria has a head start, resources, and probably a plan she's been developing for months. She's not going to be easy to find." I thought about Ethan, probably confused and scared, trusting Victoria because he'd been raised to respect adult authority and family relationships. He might not even realize he was being kidnapped. In his mind, Victoria was just taking him somewhere safe to recover from his accident. The irony was devastating. The woman who'd tried to murder him was now his primary caretaker, and he was worried about getting her in trouble for what he remembered about the incident. "We need to find them," I said, the words coming out stronger than I felt. "Before she decides that killing Ethan is easier than running with him." Helena nodded grimly. "The good news is that we have enough evidence to convince law enforcement that this is a serious threat. The bad news is that Victoria has proven she's willing to kill to protect her secrets, and now she has nothing left to lose." As night fell over the Pacific, I stared out at the dark water and tried not to think about how easy it would be to make a small boy disappear forever, somewhere in the vast emptiness of the ocean. Victoria had underestimated me once, assuming I would accept her version of events and quietly fade into the background of a family that no longer wanted me. She wouldn't make that mistake again. But I had underestimated her too, and now Ethan was paying the price for my miscalculation. The hunt for my brother was about to begin, and I had no idea how much time we had left to save him. The FBI field office in San Francisco buzzed with controlled urgency at 2 in the morning, the kind of energy that comes when professionals realize they're dealing with something more complex than a standard missing child case. Agent Rebecca Torres, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and prematurely gray hair, had been working kidnapping cases for 15 years, but she'd rarely seen evidence packets as comprehensive as the one Helena and I had delivered. "This is impressive work," Torres said, scrolling through the financial records and email communications on her computer screen. "Most family members come to us with hunches and emotions. You've built a solid case for premeditation and fraud." She looked up at me. "The question now is where Victoria Sterling would take an 8-year-old boy when she's running for her life." I'd been asking myself the same question for hours, running through every conversation I'd ever had with Victoria, every casual comment about travel preferences or favorite destinations. But Victoria was careful about personal information, revealing just enough to seem open while keeping her true thoughts locked away behind that perpetual smile. "She's not impulsive," I said. "Everything she's done has been planned, calculated. She wouldn't grab Ethan without having an exit strategy ready." "Any properties we should know about? Vacation homes, rental investments, family connections in other states?" Helena consulted the legal files spread across the conference table. "The trust documents list several properties, but they're all in Richard Blackwood's name or held by the company. Victoria wouldn't have independent access to most of them." Quote, "What about before she married your father?" Torres asked me. "Previous relationships, family background, anywhere she might have maintained connections." It was embarrassing to realize how little I actually knew about Victoria's life before she became part of our family. She'd been deliberately vague about her past, claiming that she preferred to focus on the future rather than dwelling on old relationships and disappointments. I'd assumed it was just her way of avoiding awkward step-family dynamics, but now I wondered if there was more to her secrecy. "She mentioned growing up in the Pacific Northwest," I said. "Seattle, I think, or maybe Portland. And she had some kind of business background before she met Dad. Something in hospitality or event management." Torres nodded, making notes. "We'll run a complete background check, trace her financial history, cross-reference with property records and vehicle registrations. If she's planning to disappear permanently, she'll need cash, transportation, and somewhere to stay that can't be easily traced back to her." "What about Gerald Ashford?" Helena interjected. "The email exchanges show he's been collaborating with Victoria's plans. He might know where she's gone. We'll bring him in for questioning, but people like that usually have lawyers on speed dial and know how to avoid saying anything incriminating." Torres leaned back in her chair. "The reality is that Victoria has several hours, head start, and probably months of preparation. She could be anywhere by now." The thought of Ethan somewhere unknown, confused and possibly frightened, made my chest tight with helpless rage. But Agent Torres was right, that emotion wouldn't help us find him faster. We needed to think like Victoria, to anticipate her moves based on what we knew about her psychology and resources. "She's not running randomly," I said, trying to work through the logic. "Victoria's whole identity is built on control and careful planning. Even in crisis mode, she'd stick to strategies that feel safe and familiar." "What feels safe to her?" "Luxury, comfort. Places where money can buy privacy and no one asks uncomfortable questions." I thought about Victoria's preferences, her insistence on 5-star hotels and exclusive restaurants, her discomfort with anything that felt rough around the edges. She wouldn't hide out in some cheap motel or campground. She'd find somewhere upscale and discreet. Torres was already reaching for her phone. "I'll put out alerts to high-end hotels and resorts within a 6-hour driving radius. Credit card companies, car rental agencies, private charter services. If she's spending money, we'll find the trail." But even as the FBI machinery kicked into gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something obvious. Victoria was smart enough to know that her financial transactions would be monitored once Ethan's disappearance was reported. She wouldn't use credit cards or make reservations under her own name unless she wanted to be found, which meant either she had access to resources we didn't know about, or she was planning something that made long-term hiding unnecessary. Marcus arrived just after 3 a.m., looking like he'd thrown on clothes and driven straight from his lab without stopping to consider whether showing up at an FBI field office in the middle of the night might seem suspicious. His hair was disheveled, and he was carrying a laptop bag that probably contained more marine biology research than most federal agents had ever seen. "I've been going through the behavioral monitoring data," he said without preamble, setting up his computer on the conference table. "Not just from yesterday, but going back months. If Victoria's been planning this, there might be patterns in her visits to the aquarium that could tell us something about her exit strategy." Agent Torres looked skeptical. "You think she left clues in fish tank security footage?" "Not clues exactly, but data points. Every time someone uses a keycard, every interaction with staff, every deviation from normal visitor patterns gets logged automatically." Marcus pulled up a complex spreadsheet that looked like something designed by scientists for scientists. "Victoria's been coming to the aquarium more frequently over the past 6 months, but not for the reasons you'd expect." He highlighted a series of entries in red. These visits correspond to times when the main public areas were closed for maintenance or private events. She wasn't coming to see the exhibits, she was coming when she could move around without being observed by regular visitors. What was she doing during those visits? That's what's interesting. According to staff logs, she claimed to be checking on maintenance projects and security upgrades. But look at this. Marcus switched to a different screen showing a facility map with colored dots marking movement patterns. She spent most of her time in administrative areas and storage facilities, not anywhere near active construction or security installations. I studied the patterns, trying to understand what Victoria might have been looking for in storage areas and back offices. She was learning the layout, understanding how to move through the facility without being seen. "More than that," Marcus said. "Look at these timestamps. She was there during shift changes, when security coverage is lightest, and staff attention is focused on handoff procedures rather than monitoring." Agent Torres leaned forward, suddenly more interested. "You're saying she was conducting reconnaissance on her own family's business?" "For months," Marcus confirmed. "And there's something else. 3 weeks ago, she requested access to the emergency evacuation plans for all Pacific Marine Enterprises facilities. She claimed it was for insurance purposes, updating safety protocols after some regulatory changes." "Did she get the plans? Full access? Evacuation routes, emergency contacts, backup power systems, off-site storage locations?" Marcus looked grim. "Everything someone would need to know if they wanted to disappear from one of our facilities without leaving a trace." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Victoria hadn't just been planning to kill Ethan and frame it as an accident. She'd been preparing for the possibility that her initial plan might fail, that she might need to evacuate quickly with her primary target and disappear completely. "She's not running to some random hiding place," I realized. "She's using our own emergency protocols against us." Agent Torres was already on her phone, barking orders about expanding the search to include all Pacific Marine Enterprises properties and associated facilities. But I was thinking about something else. A detail that had been nagging at the back of my mind since we'd started this investigation. "Marcus," I said, "pull up the maintenance logs from yesterday morning right before Ethan's accident." He typed quickly, bringing up a detailed schedule of routine work and system checks. Nothing unusual. Standard weekly maintenance on the filtration systems, some landscaping work around the outdoor exhibits, and a delivery for the gift shop. "What kind of delivery?" "Emergency supplies for the Marine Mammal Rescue Facility. Medical equipment, transport containers, that sort of thing." Marcus paused, his expression shifting to alarm. "Wait, the delivery was authorized by Victoria, but the rescue facility coordinator says they didn't request any emergency supplies." Agent Torres looked up from her phone call. "What kind of transport containers?" Large enough to hold injured seals or small dolphins during medical transport, Marcus said. Insulated, with their own life support systems, and designed to be completely sealed for several hours without outside intervention. The room went quiet as we all realized what that meant. Victoria hadn't just improvised Ethan's kidnapping. She'd been preparing for it, ordering equipment that could transport a small child safely but invisibly, containers that would raise no suspicions if spotted at a marine facility. She could have taken him anywhere, Torres said grimly. Hidden in a transport container, he'd be completely undetectable. No witnesses, no security footage showing a struggling child. Nothing to indicate anything other than routine equipment transfer. I felt sick thinking about Ethan trapped in a sealed container, probably unconscious from sedatives, while Victoria drove him toward whatever final destination she'd chosen. But the transport containers also represented an opportunity. They were specialized equipment, expensive and rare, not the kind of thing you could buy anonymously or dispose of easily. How many facilities in the region have equipment like that? I asked. Marcus was already searching through industry databases. Maybe 24 within 500 miles. Marine parks, research institutions, rescue facilities. Some private collectors with special permits. He looked up. But most of them are connected to the Marine Biology Network. We know people at almost all of these places. Start calling them, Agent Torres ordered. Find out if anyone's had unusual equipment requests, unexpected deliveries, or suspicious visitors in the last 24 hours. And get me a complete manifest of what was in that delivery to your rescue facility. While Marcus worked his network of marine biology contacts, I found myself staring at the facility map on his computer screen, trying to think like Victoria. She had Ethan, she had specialized transport equipment, and she had detailed knowledge of emergency evacuation protocols for marine facilities throughout the region. But she also had a problem, a kidnapped child, and a growing law enforcement dragnet that would make it increasingly difficult to move around unnoticed, unless she wasn't planning to move around much longer. Agent Torres, I said slowly, what if she's not running? What if she's gonna ground somewhere she feels safe? Somewhere she has control over the environment and access to resources? Like where? Like another Pacific Marine Enterprises facility. Somewhere remote enough to avoid immediate detection, but familiar enough that she knows how to operate independently. I turned to Marcus. What's our most isolated property? Somewhere Victoria could access with her executive credentials, but where she could avoid staff contact for several days? Marcus consulted his database. The research station on Channel Island. It's technically closed for renovations right now, but executive staff still have access for inspection purposes. Skeleton crew, minimal security, and completely self-sufficient for emergency situations. Agent Torres was already coordinating with the Coast Guard before Marcus finished explaining the location. But I was thinking about something else, a conversation I'd had with our father years ago about the Channel Island facility and why he'd insisted on maintaining it despite the costs. It's not just a research station, I said. Dad built it as a prototype for sustainable marine facilities in remote locations. It has its own power generation, water treatment, food storage, everything needed to operate independently for weeks without outside support. Perfect for someone who wants to disappear, Torres agreed, but also perfect for someone who needs time to make a kidnapped child disappear permanently. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. We all knew what Victoria's endgame had to be. She couldn't keep Ethan alive indefinitely, not when his testimony could destroy her, even if she managed to evade the kidnapping charges. Eventually, she would have to eliminate the witness to her original crime. The only question was how much time we had before she decided that eventually had become now. The Coast Guard helicopter lifted off from San Francisco Bay just as dawn was breaking over the Pacific, its rotors cutting through morning fog that seemed determined to hide whatever secrets the Channel Islands might be keeping. I sat beside Agent Torres, wearing a borrowed tactical vest that felt too heavy and too light at the same time, watching the mainland shrink into a gray smudge behind us. Remember, Torres said over the headset, if Victoria is there, she's desperate and dangerous. Our priority is getting your brother out safely, not proving a point or getting revenge. I nodded, but my hands were clenched so tightly that my fingernails left crescents in my palms. The rational part of my brain understood the need for caution and professional protocol, but the sister part of my brain just wanted to find Ethan and make sure he was safe, regardless of what happened to Victoria in the process. The Channel Island Research Facility came into view 20 minutes later, a cluster of low buildings perched on a rocky promontory overlooking the Pacific. It looked peaceful from the air, almost idyllic, but I could see the Coast Guard patrol boat already circling the island's small harbor, and knew that appearances were deceiving. "There," the pilot said, pointing to a white sedan parked beside the main laboratory building. "Vehicle matches the description from the hospital security footage." Agent Torres confirmed the identification through her binoculars, then coordinated with the tactical team that was approaching from the patrol boat. The plan was simple: surround the facility, cut off any escape routes, then negotiate for Ethan's safe release while gathering evidence of Victoria's crimes. But plans involving desperate people rarely stayed simple for long. We landed on a flat section of beach about a quarter-mile from the main buildings, far enough away to avoid alerting Victoria, but close enough to move quickly if the situation deteriorated. The island was eerily quiet, except for the sound of waves and seabirds. No sign of human activity despite the presence of Victoria's car. "Could be sleeping," Torres muttered, checking her weapon and radio equipment. "Or could be gone. That car might be a decoy while she escaped by boat." I thought about the transport containers Marcus had mentioned, the specialized equipment designed to move marine animals safely over long distances. If Victoria had access to a boat and the right equipment, she could have already transferred Ethan to another location while leaving her car behind to misdirect our search efforts. But as we approached the main laboratory building, I noticed something that made me reconsider that theory. The facility's emergency power system was running, evidenced by the quiet hum of generators and the glow of security lights that shouldn't have been necessary during daylight hours. Someone was actively using the building's systems, drawing power from more than just basic monitoring equipment. "She's here," I said quietly. "And she's planning to stay for a while." Agent Torres signaled the tactical team, and we moved into position around the laboratory complex. The building's layout was familiar to me from childhood visits with our father, who'd used the facility for marine biology research before converting it into a prototype for sustainable aquarium operations. I knew there were multiple entrances, several levels both above and below ground, and enough hiding places to make a thorough search challenging. But I also knew something Victoria might not have considered. The building's original design included extensive environmental monitoring systems, cameras and sensors throughout the structure that tracked everything from water temperature to air quality. If those systems were still active, they might tell us exactly where she was keeping Ethan. "There's a security office on the ground floor," I whispered to Torres. "If I can access the monitoring systems, I might be able to locate them without having to search room by room." Torres looked skeptical. "Too risky. She might have booby traps or be watching the security feeds herself. The monitoring systems are designed for marine research, not human security. She might not even know they exist." I pointed to a service entrance that would allow me to reach the security office without going through the main corridors. 5 minutes, just enough time to check the camera feeds and confirm their location. It was a calculated risk, but the alternative was a room-by-room search that could take hours and might end, with Victoria deciding that killing Ethan was preferable to negotiating his release. Agent Torres reluctantly agreed, but insisted on maintaining radio contact and aborting the mission if I encountered any resistance. The service entrance was unlocked, which struck me as either careless or confident on Victoria's part. I slipped inside and made my way through corridors I hadn't walked in more than a decade, guided by memories of childhood exploration and scientific curiosity. The building felt different than I remembered, emptier somehow, as if Victoria's presence had drained some essential warmth from the space. The security office was exactly where I'd expected, tucked behind the main laboratory in a space that had been designed for researchers rather than law enforcement. The monitoring equipment was more sophisticated than I'd hoped, with dozens of camera feeds showing different areas of the facility in real time. It took me several minutes to figure out the interface, but eventually I found what I was looking for. Camera feeds from the lower level showed Victoria in what had once been our father's private office, sitting at a desk with her laptop open and her phone pressed to her ear. She looked calm, almost relaxed, as if conducting business from a remote office rather than holding a child hostage on an isolated island. But Ethan was nowhere to be seen. I cycled through every available camera feed, checking storage rooms, laboratories, living quarters, even the mechanical spaces where the facility's life support systems were housed. Nothing. Either Victoria had him in one of the few areas not covered by cameras, or something had happened to him that I didn't want to consider. Then I noticed something odd about the lower-level layout. There was a door in Victoria's current location that didn't appear on any of the camera feeds, a space that seemed to exist on the building's blueprints but wasn't covered by the monitoring system. I pulled up the facility's original construction documents on the security computer, trying to understand why that particular room would be excluded from surveillance. The answer was both relieving and terrifying. The room was a specialized holding area, originally designed for injured marine animals that needed isolation during medical treatment. It was soundproof, climate-controlled, and completely self-contained, perfect for housing a patient who might be stressed by outside stimuli. It was also the perfect place to hide a kidnapped child. I radioed Agent Torres with the location, then made my way back toward the service entrance. But as I reached the main corridor, I heard something that stopped me cold. Ethan's voice, muffled but unmistakable, calling for help somewhere below me. Every instinct screamed at me to go to him immediately, to abandon protocol and rescue my brother before Victoria realized we'd found her hiding place. But I also knew that one wrong move could turn a hostage situation into a murder scene. And Ethan was too important to risk on impulse. Instead, I pressed myself against the wall and listened, trying to gather information about Victoria's state of mind and Ethan's condition. Her voice drifted up from the lower level, too quiet to make out individual words, but carrying a tone of frustrated impatience that suggested things weren't going according to her plan. Then I heard something that changed everything. A third voice, male and unfamiliar, speaking with the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed. Victoria wasn't alone. She had an accomplice, someone who'd either been part of her plan from the beginning or had joined her after the kidnapping went public. Either way, it meant the situation was more complex and dangerous than we'd anticipated. I keyed my radio to update Agent Torres, but before I could speak, the building's fire alarm system activated with a deafening wail that echoed through every corridor. Emergency lights began flashing, and I could hear the distinctive sound of fire suppression systems activating in distant parts of the building. Victoria had triggered the facility's emergency protocols, creating chaos and confusion that would make it much harder for law enforcement to coordinate a safe rescue. But she'd also made a critical mistake. The fire alarm system was connected to automated safety protocols that would unlock certain doors and activate additional monitoring systems, including cameras in the previously hidden holding room where Ethan was being kept. I ran back to the security office, ignoring the cacophony of alarms and the increasingly urgent radio chatter from Agent Torres. The additional camera feeds were coming online automatically, showing spaces I hadn't been able to access before. And there, in a sterile white room designed for injured sea lions, I saw my 8-year-old brother. Ethan was alive and appeared unharmed, sitting on what looked like a medical examination table, while his hands were restrained with zip ties. He looked scared, but not panicked, still trusting that someone would come to help him, even though he probably didn't understand why Victoria had brought him to this strange place. But the real shock was seeing who else was in the room with him. Gerald Ashford, the board member who'd been collaborating with Victoria's financial schemes, stood beside the examination table with something in his hand that looked like a medical syringe. They weren't just planning to make Ethan disappear. They were planning to make it look like an accident, probably some kind of allergic reaction or medical emergency that could be blamed on stress from his recent trauma. Gerald's background in pharmaceutical investments would give him access to drugs that could simulate natural medical crises, creating a death that would seem tragic, but not suspicious. I keyed my radio with shaking fingers. Torres, I've got visual confirmation. Lower level, medical holding room. Ethan's alive, but they've got a syringe. I think they're planning to kill him right now. The response was immediate and decisive. All units move in. This is no longer a negotiation. But even as I heard the tactical team breaching the building's main entrances, I knew they might not reach the lower level in time. The facility's layout was confusing, with multiple corridors and stairwells that could delay even experienced professionals. And if Victoria and Gerald heard the team coming, they might decide to accelerate their timeline rather than risk capture. I made a decision that was probably stupid but felt absolutely necessary. Instead of waiting for backup, I headed for the nearest stairwell, leading to the lower level. I wasn't armed, I wasn't trained for tactical situations, and I had no idea what I would do when I reached the holding room. But I was Ethan's sister, and he was counting on me to save him, just like I'd been counting on myself to figure out Victoria's plan before it was too late. The alarms were even louder in the stairwell, echoing off concrete walls in a way that made it impossible to hear approaching footsteps or radio communications. I moved as quietly as possible, trying to remember the lower level's layout from childhood visits while staying alert for any sign that Victoria or Gerald knew about the tactical team's approach. The holding room was at the end of a long corridor lined with other medical and research facilities, most of them dark and unused since the renovation project had begun. But lights were on in the room where Ethan was being held, and I could see shadows moving beyond the partially open door. I pressed myself against the wall and listened, trying to understand what was happening without alerting them to my presence. Gerald's voice was clearer now, professional and detached as he discussed dosages and timing with Victoria. The compound will simulate anaphylactic shock, he was saying. Given his recent head trauma and the stress of the kidnapping, it will appear to be a delayed reaction to the shark attack. Tragic but medically plausible. How long before it takes effect? Victoria asked, her tone as calm as if they were discussing dinner plans rather than child murder. Less than 5 minutes from injection to cardiac arrest. Quick enough to prevent suffering, but slow enough for us to establish an alibi by claiming we found him in distress and called for emergency medical assistance. I felt nauseated by the clinical way they discussed killing my brother, but I forced myself to keep listening. The tactical team would need every detail about their plan and timeline to coordinate a safe rescue. And you're certain this won't be detected in an autopsy? Victoria pressed. The compound breaks down rapidly in body tissue. By the time anyone thinks to test for it specifically, there won't be enough residue to prove anything other than a severe allergic reaction. That was enough. I keyed my radio as quietly as possible and whispered their location and plans to Agent Torres, then began moving toward the holding room's entrance. I didn't have a weapon or a plan, but I had surprise in the desperate determination of someone who refused to let her family be destroyed by greed and sociopathy. The door was slightly ajar, giving me a narrow view of the room's interior. Ethan sat on the examination table looking confused but not yet terrified, probably because he didn't understand what the adults were planning. Gerald stood beside him with the syringe, rolling up Ethan's sleeve while explaining that he was just giving him some medicine to help him feel better after his accident. Victoria watched from across the room, her expression as cold and calculating as I'd ever seen it. She'd abandoned any pretense of concern for Ethan's welfare, revealing the predator that had been hidden beneath years of perfect stepmother performance. Quote, "This is necessary," she said, apparently responding to some hesitation on Gerald's part. "The boy remembers too much about what happened at the aquarium. Even if we manage to discredit his sister's accusations, his testimony could still cause problems down the line." "I understand," Gerald replied, "but I want it noted that this was your decision, not mine. I'm simply providing technical assistance." "Noted and irrelevant," Victoria said sharply. "We're both equally culpable at this point. Just do it." Gerald raised the syringe toward Ethan's arm, and I knew I was out of time. The tactical team was still fighting their way through the facility's confusing layout, and even if they reached us in the next few minutes, it would be too late to prevent whatever poison Gerald was about to inject into my brother's bloodstream. I pushed through the door hard enough to slam it against the wall, startling both adults and causing Gerald to fumble the syringe. "Get away from him!" I shouted, putting as much authority into my voice as possible despite having no leverage other than moral outrage. Victoria's shock lasted only a moment before transforming into cold fury. "You should have stayed out of this, Zara. Now you've made everything much more complicated." "Zara!" Ethan's voice was full of relief and confusion. "I knew you'd come. Victoria said we were going on a special trip, but then she tied me up, and this man wants to give me medicine that I don't need." Gerald had recovered the syringe and was looking between Victoria and me with obvious uncertainty about how to proceed. "This wasn't part of the plan," he said nervously. "We were supposed to have hours before anyone found this location." "Plans change," Victoria replied, her voice as calm as ever. "Gerald, deal with the boy. I'll handle his sister." It was surreal to watch someone I'd known for 5 years reveal herself as a completely different person. Someone capable of ordering child murder with the same tone she might use to request a dinner reservation. But it also clarified something important. This wasn't about money or inheritance anymore, if it ever had been. This was about power and control. About Victoria's inability to tolerate anyone who threatened her carefully constructed version of reality. "You don't have to do this," I said, trying to buy time while listening for sounds of the tactical team's approach. "Take the money and disappear. Leave Ethan out of it." Victoria laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. "Take the money and disappear? Do you have any idea how much money we're talking about? Pacific Marine Enterprises is worth $50 million, and that's just the current valuation. With proper management, it could be worth 10 times that within a decade. So this is about money. This is about legacy," she snapped. "Your father built something remarkable, but he was too sentimental to maximize its potential. He cared more about marine conservation than profit margins, more about education than entertainment value. I'm gonna fix that. By killing children? By removing obstacles," Victoria said coldly. "You and your brother represent outdated thinking, emotional attachment to policies that limit growth and profitability. The board will be much more receptive to necessary changes once they're not worried about respecting Richard's sentimental wishes." I looked at Gerald, hoping to find some vestige of human conscience that might make him refuse to participate in child murder. But his expression was resigned, the look of someone who'd already crossed too many lines to consider backing down now. "She's right about the money," he said, almost apologetically. "The current operational model limits our return on investment to less than 8% annually. With revised policies focused on commercial entertainment rather than education and conservation, we could easily triple that return within 5 years." They were talking about destroying everything our father had built, turning his life's work into just another corporate entertainment venture that prioritized profit over purpose. But more immediately, they were planning to murder my 8-year-old brother to eliminate his potential interference with their business plan. The syringe was still in Gerald's hand, and he was moving toward Ethan again despite my presence. Victoria had positioned herself between me and the examination table, clearly prepared to physically prevent me from interfering with their plan. "Zara, what's happening?" Ethan asked, his voice smaller now as he began to understand that the adults around him were not all trying to help him. "Why won't anyone untie me? I want to go home." "You are going home, buddy," I promised, though I had no idea how to make that true. Everything's going to be okay. But everything was not going to be okay unless I found a way to stop Gerald from injecting whatever poison he'd prepared, and Victoria from preventing my intervention. I was outnumbered, unarmed, and trapped in a soundproof room with 2 people who'd already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder. The tactical team's arrival felt like a miracle, wrapped in explosive charges and shouted commands. The holding room's door imploded inward as federal agents flooded the space with professional precision, weapons drawn and voices raised in the kind of authoritative commands that brooked no argument or hesitation. "Federal agents, drop the weapon, get on the ground, now!" Gerald dropped the syringe immediately, his pharmaceutical expertise apparently not extending to combat situations. But Victoria's response was different, more desperate and dangerous. Instead of surrendering, she grabbed a medical scalpel from the examination table's instrument tray and pressed it against Ethan's throat. "Everyone stay back," she ordered, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "One more step and the boy dies right now, not in 5 minutes." The tactical team froze, weapons trained on Victoria but unable to fire without risking Ethan's life. Agent Torres appeared in the doorway behind them, her expression grim as she assessed the standoff that had replaced their planned rescue operation. "Victoria," Torres said calmly, "let's talk about this. You're smart enough to know that killing a hostage in front of federal agents won't improve your situation." "My situation?" Victoria laughed, the sound even more chilling when accompanied by the glint of surgical steel against my brother's skin. "My situation is that I've spent 5 years building something remarkable, only to have it threatened by a sentimental child and his emotionally unstable sister." "What you've built is a criminal enterprise," Torres replied. "Fraud, attempted murder, kidnapping. But if you surrender now, if you don't hurt that boy, I can guarantee you'll live to see trial." "I don't want to see trial," Victoria said. "I want to see success. I want to see Pacific Marine Enterprises become everything it could be instead of everything Richard's outdated sentimentality prevented it from becoming." She was still talking about business plans while holding a knife to an 8-year-old's throat, still convinced that murder was a reasonable solution to corporate governance problems. The complete disconnect from moral reality was almost as frightening as the immediate physical threat she represented. "Victoria," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the terror clawing at my chest, "look at what you're doing. Look at who you've become. Is this really who you want to be remembered as?" For just a moment, something flickered across her expression. Some ghost of the woman who'd once charmed our father into marriage and convinced us that she wanted to be part of our family. But it was gone so quickly that I might have imagined it, replaced by the cold calculation that had become her defining characteristic. "I want to be remembered as the person who saved Pacific Marine Enterprises from irrelevance," she said, "who transformed it from a glorified petting zoo into a real business empire." The scalpel pressed a little deeper against Ethan's throat, and I saw him wince. He was trying to be brave, but he was 8 years old and scared and didn't understand why someone he'd trusted was hurting him. The sight of his fear made something savage and protective rise up in my chest, overriding every instinct for caution and self-preservation. But before I could do something stupid and potentially fatal, Agent Torres made a gesture that caught my attention. She was signaling to someone behind her, coordinating with the tactical team in ways that suggested they had a plan for ending this standoff safely. "Victoria," Torres said, "I'm going to need you to think about your long-term interests here. Right now, you're facing kidnapping charges and attempted murder. Serious time, but not necessarily life in prison. But if you hurt that child, if you commit murder in front of witnesses, you'll be looking at the death penalty." "I'm already looking at the death penalty," Victoria replied. "Gerald's pharmaceutical expertise goes both ways. If I go to prison, I'll never make it to trial." She was probably right about that. Gerald's connections in the pharmaceutical industry would make it relatively easy to arrange for a conveniently timed medical emergency or suicide that eliminated Victoria as a potential witness against other conspirators. She was trapped by her own criminal associations, unable to surrender without signing her own death warrant, which made her infinitely more dangerous to everyone in the room. "Then let's talk about alternatives," Torres said carefully. "Witness protection, plea agreements, ways to ensure your safety while minimizing the consequences for everyone involved." But Victoria was no longer listening to negotiation attempts. Her attention had shifted to something behind the tactical team, and her expression was changing from desperate resolve to genuine surprise. "You," she said, her voice carrying a mix of shock and betrayal. "What are you doing here?" I turned to see who had entered the room, expecting another federal agent or Coast Guard officer. Instead, I saw Marcus stepping through the doorway with his hands raised in a gesture of non-threatening surrender. "I came to help," he said simply. "Victoria, this has gone far enough. Let the boy go and we can figure out a way to resolve this that doesn't end with anyone else getting hurt." "You're supposed to be with the research team," Victoria said, her grip on the scalpel wavering slightly. "You're not supposed to be here." "None of us are supposed to be here," Marcus replied. "This whole situation is insane and you know it. Richard would be horrified by what you're doing to his children." "Don't you dare invoke his name," Victoria snapped. "Richard is dead, and his children are obstacles to everything he actually cared about. Pacific Marine Enterprises deserves better than sentimental attachment to outdated policies." Richard cared about his family more than he cared about money, Marcus said firmly. And his family includes Ethan and Z. Marcus took another careful step into the room, his hand still raised but his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades working with dangerous marine predators. Victoria, I've been reviewing the financial records you've been hiding. The phantom consulting fees, the equipment purchases that never happened, the marketing campaigns that existed only on paper. You've embezzled over $3 million in the past 18 months. Victoria's composure cracked for the first time since I'd known her. The scalpel trembled against Ethan's throat as she processed the implications of Marcus's words. You have no authority to access those records. I have every authority, Marcus replied calmly. Richard made me a backup trustee for exactly this kind of situation. When the primary trustee becomes incapacitated or compromised, I have full audit powers over all trust assets and operations. Agent Torres looked confused, but I understood immediately what Marcus was doing. He was creating a legal framework that would strip Victoria of her authority over Pacific Marine Enterprises and the trust funds, eliminating her financial motivation for murder while establishing legitimate grounds for federal prosecution. That's impossible, Victoria said, but uncertainty had crept into her voice. I would have been notified of any backup trustee appointments. You were, Marcus said, pulling a folded document from his jacket pocket. Richard's attorney sent the paperwork to your office 6 months after the funeral. Your assistant signed for it, but apparently you never read past the cover letter. He held up the document, and even from across the room I could see the official seals and signatures that marked it as a legitimate legal instrument. Victoria stared at it with growing horror, realizing that her careful plans had been undermined by bureaucratic details she'd ignored. This changes nothing, she said, though her voice lacked its previous conviction. Even if you have audit authority, you can't reverse what's already been done. Actually, I can, Marcus replied, and I already have. As of this morning, all Pacific Marine Enterprises accounts have been frozen, pending investigation of fraudulent transactions. Your personal accounts have been seized as potential repositories for stolen funds. And the board has been notified that you're no longer authorized to make any decisions regarding company operations. The scalpel pressed harder against Ethan's throat, and I saw a thin line of blood appear on his skin. He whimpered softly, a sound that cut through me like broken glass. Victoria, Agent Torres said urgently, you're hurting him. Whatever's happening with the business can be sorted out later, but right now we need to focus on everyone's safety. There is no later, Victoria screamed, her perfect composure finally shattering completely. Don't you understand? This was my only chance to build something real, something lasting. I spent 5 years playing the perfect stepmother to a man who cared more about fish than profit margins. 5 years pretending to love children who represented everything holding back the company's potential. So you decided to kill them, I said, unable to keep the disgust out of my voice. I decided to remove obstacles, Victoria corrected. Ethan's death would have been tragic but accidental, a delayed reaction to his traumatic shark encounter. Your death would have been a suicide, grief-stricken sister unable to cope with losing her baby brother. Clean, simple, emotionally satisfying for anyone looking for narrative closure. And Gerald was going to help you fake the medical evidence, Marcus added grimly. Victoria glanced toward Gerald, who was still on the ground with federal agents keeping him subdued. Gerald understands business necessities better than most people. He knows that sometimes individual sacrifices are required for larger success. Individual sacrifices, Agent Torres repeated. You mean murdering children? I mean making difficult decisions that weak-minded people are incapable of making, Victoria snapped. Pacific Marine Enterprises could be worth $500 million within a decade with proper management. Instead, it's stagnating under policies designed to prioritize marine conservation over commercial viability. She was still talking about business strategy while holding a knife to an 8-year-old's throat, still convinced that profit margins justified child murder. The complete moral disconnection was both fascinating and terrifying, like watching someone who'd convinced themselves that gravity was optional. But her grip on the scalpel was becoming less steady as the reality of her situation sank in. The financial empire she'd been building had been dismantled in a matter of hours. Her co-conspirators were in federal custody, and her only remaining leverage was a frightened child, who represented everything she'd claimed to despise about sentimental family attachments. "Victoria," Marcus said gently, "it's over. The fraud investigation will take months, but the evidence is overwhelming. Your only choice now is whether this ends with one tragedy or two." "It could end with no tragedies," Agent Torres added. "If you let Ethan go now, if you surrender peacefully, you'll live to fight the charges in court. Maybe some of them won't stick. Maybe you'll get a plea deal. Maybe you'll find a way to minimize the consequences. Or maybe I'll die in federal custody before I ever see trial," Victoria replied bitterly. "Gerald's pharmaceutical connections go in both directions, as I mentioned. People who know too much about certain business arrangements don't tend to have long life expectancies in prison." I realized with growing horror that Victoria was right about that. Gerald's involvement suggested connections to much larger criminal networks, organizations that would have strong incentives to prevent Victoria from testifying about their activities. If she surrendered, she'd probably be dead within weeks, regardless of protective custody arrangements, which meant she had nothing left to lose, and every reason to take Ethan with her into whatever violent conclusion she'd chosen for this confrontation. "Then let's talk about alternatives," I said desperately. "Witness protection programs, international asylum, ways to disappear completely without hurting anyone else." Victoria looked at me with something that might have been pity if it hadn't been so cold. "Zara, you're still thinking like your father's daughter. Still believing that everyone deserves a happy ending if they just try hard enough to find compromise solutions. I'm thinking like someone who doesn't want to watch you murder my brother." "Your brother is already dead," Victoria said matter-of-factly. "The only question is whether his death serves a larger purpose or just creates additional complications for everyone involved." The casual way she discussed killing Ethan made something snap inside my chest, some fundamental belief in human decency that couldn't survive contact with such casual evil. But before I could respond with the rage that was threatening to overwhelm my capacity for rational thought, Marcus caught my attention with a subtle gesture. He was positioning himself for something, moving incrementally closer to the examination table while keeping Victoria's attention focused on the conversation. Agent Torres seemed to recognize what he was doing, shifting her own position to create multiple angles of approach without being obvious about it. "Victoria," Torres said, "I need you to understand something important about your current situation. Right now, you're facing federal kidnapping charges, which carry a maximum sentence of life in prison. But if you harm that child, if you commit murder in front of witnesses, you're looking at capital punishment. That's not negotiable, regardless of any other considerations." "I'm looking at death either way," Victoria replied. "At least this way, I control the circumstances." "You're looking at uncertainty," Torres corrected. "Kidnapping charges can be negotiated, reduced, sometimes dismissed entirely based on mitigating circumstances and cooperation agreements. But murder charges, especially child murder, don't get negotiated." Victoria seemed to consider this for a moment, her grip on the scalpel loosening slightly as she processed the legal implications. But then her expression hardened again, and I saw her make some internal decision that left no room for compromise. "Agent Torres," she said formally, "I want you to record this confession for legal purposes. My name is Victoria Sterling, and I am responsible for the attempted murder of Ethan Blackwood on Tuesday morning at the Blackwood Oceanarium. I pushed him into the shark tank with the intention of causing his death and making it appear accidental." The room went dead silent except for the background hum of the facility's life support systems. Victoria was confessing to attempted murder while actively threatening to complete the job, creating a legal record that would eliminate any possibility of claiming temporary insanity or diminished capacity. "I am also responsible for systematic embezzlement from Pacific Marine Enterprises over the past 18 months, utilizing fraudulent consulting fees and fictitious equipment purchases to transfer approximately $3.2 million into offshore accounts controlled by myself and Gerald Ashford." Gerald tried to protest from his position on the floor, but the federal agents kept him subdued and silent. Victoria continued her confession with the same calm precision she might use to dictate a business memo, documenting criminal conspiracy with professional thoroughness. The original plan was to eliminate both Blackwood heirs through carefully staged accidents, then restructure Pacific Marine Enterprises as a purely commercial entertainment venture, focused on profit maximization rather than marine conservation. The projected return on investment under revised operational parameters was estimated at 24% annually, compared to current returns of approximately 8%. She was confessing to conspiracy and premeditated murder while explaining her business rationale, still convinced that profit margins justified any level of violence or betrayal. It was like listening to someone describe genocide as a population management strategy, clinical and detached from any recognition of moral consequences. "Victoria," Marcus said quietly, "you don't have to do this. Confession might actually help your legal situation if you cooperate with federal investigators." "Confession helps my peace of mind," Victoria replied. "I want there to be no ambiguity about my motivations or methods." This wasn't madness or temporary breakdown. This was calculated business strategy implemented by someone who understood the stakes involved. The scalpel moved against Ethan's throat again, and I saw him close his eyes tightly, probably trying to pretend this was all a nightmare he could wake up from. The sight of his fear and confusion broke something fundamental inside me, some last vestige of belief that this situation could be resolved through negotiation and reason. "Let him go," I said, my voice coming out harder than I'd intended. "Kill me instead if you need to eliminate a Blackwood heir, but let him go. He's 8 years old, Victoria. He doesn't understand business strategy or inheritance law. He just wants to go home and play with his stuffed sharks." "That's exactly the problem," Victoria said sadly. "His innocence. His sentimental attachment to his father's conservation policies. His complete inability to understand commercial necessities. He represents everything that's been holding Pacific Marine Enterprises back from achieving its potential. He represents everything good about our father's legacy." I shot back. Curiosity, wonder, respect for life, belief that education and conservation matter more than profit margins. Sentiment, Victoria dismissed. Emotional attachment that prevents rational business decisions. Agent Torres made another subtle gesture, coordinating with the tactical team for what looked like a final intervention attempt. But Victoria caught the movement in her peripheral vision and pressed the scalpel deeper against Ethan's skin. "Everyone stays exactly where they are," she ordered. "Any movement, any attempt to interfere, and the boy dies immediately." Blood was flowing more freely now from the shallow cut on Ethan's throat. He was trying not to cry, probably because he didn't want to make Victoria angry, but tears were leaking from the corners of his eyes anyway. "Victoria," I said desperately, "please, look at him. Really look at him. He's a child who loves marine life the same way Dad did, who gets excited about sharks and dolphins, and wants to learn everything he can about ocean conservation. Killing him won't solve your business problems, it'll just destroy everything beautiful about what Dad built." For a moment, just a moment, Victoria's expression softened slightly as she looked down at Ethan. I thought maybe some vestige of human compassion might break through the cold calculation that had consumed her personality over the past 2 years. But then her face hardened again, and I realized that whatever capacity for empathy she'd once possessed had been completely overwhelmed by greed and ambition. "What your father built was a monument to missed opportunities," she said coldly. "A business that could have generated hundreds of millions in revenue and thousands of jobs. Reduced to a glorified petting zoo because he cared more about marine conservation than human prosperity." "Human prosperity built on dead children," Marcus said grimly. "Human prosperity built on rational resource allocation," Victoria corrected. "Every successful business requires difficult decisions and calculated sacrifices. The only difference is that most people are too weak to make those decisions when family relationships are involved." She was completely insane, but insane in a way that made perfect sense within her own moral framework. She'd convinced herself that murder was just another business decision, that killing children was equivalent to laying off unnecessary employees or closing unprofitable locations. The terrifying thing was that she genuinely believed she was making rational choices based on sound business principles. "Victoria," Agent Torres said, "I'm going to ask you one more time to release the child and surrender peacefully. This is your last opportunity to resolve this situation without additional violence. Additional violence? Victoria laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor or warmth. Agent Torres, there hasn't been any violence yet. Everything that's happened has been careful preparation for necessary business restructuring. You pushed an 8-year-old into a shark tank. I removed an obstacle to optimal resource utilization. You kidnapped him from a hospital. I relocated a problematic asset to a secure environment for final processing. She was talking about my brother like he was inventory in a warehouse, using business terminology to describe attempted murder and kidnapping. The complete dehumanization was almost more frightening than the physical threat, because it suggested someone who'd moved completely beyond the possibility of moral reasoning or emotional appeal. But even as Victoria continued her clinical discussion of child murder as business strategy, I noticed that her grip on the scalpel was becoming increasingly unsteady. The confession and confrontation were taking a psychological toll despite her apparent composure, and stress was beginning to affect her motor control. Marcus noticed it too, and I saw him adjust his position slightly, preparing for a moment when Victoria's attention might waver enough to allow intervention. Agent Torres was coordinating similar preparations with the tactical team, everyone waiting for an opportunity that might not come. Victoria, I said, trying a different approach, what would Dad say if he could see this? What would he think about what you're doing to his children? Richard would be disappointed that I waited this long to optimize his business model. Victoria replied without hesitation. He was too sentimental to make necessary decisions, but he was also too intelligent not to recognize their necessity when presented with clear data. Clear data that shows killing children improves profit margins. Clear data that shows removing emotional obstacles to rational decision-making improves business performance across all measurable parameters. Victoria's voice was becoming more animated as she warmed to her favorite subject. Richard's conservation policies cost Pacific Marine Enterprises approximately 40% of potential revenue annually. His educational focus reduced visitor throughput by 15% compared to pure entertainment models. His insistence on premium animal care increased operational costs by 22% over industry standards. She had statistics and percentages for everything, a complete financial justification for destroying our father's life work and murdering his children. But she also had increasingly shaky hands, and a growing tendency to focus on abstract business theory rather than immediate physical reality. Marcus caught my eye and nodded almost imperceptibly, indicating that he was ready to act if an opportunity presented itself. Agent Torres was positioned for a similar intervention, and the tactical team had weapons trained on Victoria from multiple angles. All we needed was one moment of distraction, one instant when Victoria's attention shifted away from the scalpel pressed against Ethan's throat. You know what's interesting? I said conversationally, as if we were discussing marine biology rather than murder. Dad always said that successful aquarium management was like conducting an orchestra. Every element has to work in harmony, from the smallest detail to the biggest operational decisions. Victoria glanced at me with mild irritation. Poetic metaphors don't change economic realities. Maybe not, but they do change how people respond to leadership. I took a small step closer, careful not to appear threatening. Dad's employees loved working for him, because he made them feel like they were part of something important, something that mattered beyond just making money. Employee satisfaction is less important than operational efficiency. Is it? Because I've been looking at the turnover rates since you took over, and they're pretty significant. Replacing experienced staff is expensive, especially when you're talking about specialized marine biology positions. For the first time since this confrontation began, Victoria looked genuinely uncertain. Business discussions were her comfort zone, but she was realizing that her management decisions might not have been as financially sound as she'd believed. Temporary adjustment costs, she said, but without her previous conviction. 22 experienced marine biologists in 18 months. I continued, making up numbers but sounding confident about them. Average replacement cost, including recruitment, training, and productivity loss during transition periods, runs about $40,000 per position. That's almost $900,000 in unnecessary expenses, not counting the impact on visitor experience from having inexperienced staff managing educational programs. Victoria's grip on the scalpel loosened as she processed these calculations, her attention shifting from immediate violence to abstract financial analysis. It was exactly the kind of distraction Marcus had been waiting for. He moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent decades working with dangerous animals, covering the distance to the examination table in 2 quick steps, while Victoria was still calculating employee turnover costs. His hand closed over hers, controlling the scalpel while his other arm pulled Ethan away from immediate danger. The tactical team responded instantly, flooding the space around Victoria with professional efficiency while Agent Torres coordinated the safe extraction of my brother from what had been a potential murder scene. Victoria struggled briefly, then went limp as she realized that her last source of leverage had been eliminated. "It's over," Marcus said quietly, still maintaining control of her weapon hand, while federal agents secured her with restraints designed for someone who'd proven capable of extreme violence. "It's finally over." Ethan collapsed into my arms the moment the restraints were removed from his wrists, his small body shaking with relief and residual terror. He was trying to be brave, but he was 8 years old and had just survived a kidnapping and attempted murder by someone he'd trusted. "I knew you'd come," he whispered against my shoulder. "I knew you wouldn't let anything bad happen to me." I held him tight, feeling the warmth of his breathing against my neck, and the rapid beating of his heart as evidence that we'd somehow managed to save him from Victoria's clinical insanity. But I also knew that the psychological damage from this experience would take much longer to heal than the shallow cut on his throat. "You're safe now," I promised. "You're safe, and we're going home, and none of this will ever happen again." Agent Torres approached us carefully, mindful of Ethan's fragile emotional state. "We'll need to conduct some interviews for the prosecution case, but that can wait until he's had time to recover. Right now, our priority is getting both of you somewhere secure, where you can process what's happened." I looked across the room at Victoria, now secured with federal restraints and surrounded by agents who would ensure she never had another opportunity to harm anyone. She was staring at the ceiling with an expression of mild confusion, as if she couldn't quite understand how her perfectly logical business plan had resulted in such an illogical outcome. "What happens to her now?" I asked. "Federal prosecution for kidnapping, attempted murder, conspiracy, and financial fraud," Torres replied. "Based on her confession and the evidence you've helped us gather, she's looking at multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. And Gerald, similar charges, probably willing to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. His pharmaceutical connections suggest involvement with larger criminal networks that will want to investigate thoroughly." Marcus joined us, looking exhausted but relieved. "The board will need to meet tomorrow to discuss interim management arrangements for Pacific Marine Enterprises. As backup trustee, I have authority to make operational decisions, but the long-term governance structure will need to be rebuilt from scratch." I thought about the company our father had built, the marine conservation programs Victoria had been planning to eliminate, the educational initiatives that had inspired thousands of children to care about ocean life. Everything he'd worked for had nearly been destroyed by someone who saw dollar signs where he'd seen wonder and possibility. "We'll rebuild it right," I said. "The way Dad would have wanted it, focused on conservation and education rather than just profit margins." "That's a conversation for tomorrow," Marcus said gently. "Today, let's focus on getting Ethan home and making sure he knows he's safe." As we prepared to leave the Channel Island facility, I took one last look around the medical holding room where Victoria had planned to murder my brother. It was a sterile, clinical space designed for healing injured animals, perverted into a potential crime scene by someone who'd lost the ability to distinguish between business assets and human lives. But it was also the place where Victoria's carefully constructed plan had finally collapsed, where her criminal conspiracy had been exposed, and her capacity for additional harm eliminated. In a strange way, it represented both the worst and best of human nature, the depths of greed and moral blindness, but also the power of family loyalty and professional dedication to protect innocent life. Ethan fell asleep against my shoulder during the helicopter flight back to the mainland, exhausted by trauma and stress, but finally secure in the knowledge that the adults around him were actually trying to protect rather than harm him. Agent Torres coordinated with medical personnel to ensure he'd receive appropriate psychological support, while Marcus worked with Helena to begin the legal process of restructuring Pacific Marine Enterprises under honest management. As the California coast came into view through the helicopter's windows, I realized that this nightmare was ending not with revenge or dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet satisfaction of having preserved something valuable that nearly been destroyed by evil disguised as business efficiency. Victoria Sterling had tried to murder 2 children to steal a marine conservation empire, but instead had exposed her own crimes and ensured that our father's real legacy would continue exactly as he'd envisioned it, focused on wonder, education, and the belief that protecting ocean life was worth more than any possible profit margin. The sharks at the Blackwood Oceanarium would continue swimming in their carefully maintained habitat, inspiring new generations of marine biologists and conservationists, completely unaware that they'd played a role in revealing and stopping a family's destruction. Sometimes justice doesn't roar like a great white hunting prey. Sometimes it moves quietly through deep water, patient and persistent, until the moment comes to surface and restore the natural order of things. 8 months later, I stood in the renovated boardroom of Pacific Marine Enterprises, watching Ethan press his nose against the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Monterey Bay. The morning sun cast golden ripples across the water, and a pod of dolphins was playing just beyond the harbor, their graceful arcs creating temporary sculptures against the horizon. "Look, Zara!" Ethan called excitedly, pointing at the dolphins. "They're doing synchronizing jumps, just like in the videos Dr. Marcus showed us." His enthusiasm was genuine and unforced, a testament to the remarkable resilience of children and the skill of the trauma counselors who'd helped him process what Victoria had done. The shallow scar on his throat had faded to a thin white line that would probably disappear completely within another year, but the emotional healing had taken much longer and wasn't entirely complete. He still had nightmares sometimes, dreams where trusted adults turned dangerous without warning. He was more cautious around new people, especially women who reminded him of Victoria's polished presentation. But his fundamental love of marine life had survived intact, and that gave me hope that the rest of his childhood might unfold without the shadow of betrayal defining every relationship. The boardroom itself had been completely redesigned since Victoria's arrest and trial. Gone were the sterile corporate aesthetics she'd preferred, replaced with warm wood paneling, marine photography from our father's personal collection, and display cases filled with shells, coral samples, and other treasures from decades of ocean exploration. It felt like a place where Richard Blackwood would have been comfortable making decisions about conservation funding and educational programs. Helena Cross entered the room carrying a thick folder and wearing the expression of someone who'd spent the morning dealing with bureaucratic complexities that would give most people headaches. As the lead attorney managing Victoria's prosecution and the reconstruction of Pacific Marine Enterprises, she'd become intimately familiar with both the depths of my stepmother's crimes and the intricacies of marine conservation law. "The federal sentencing hearing is scheduled for next month," she announced, settling into one of the leather chairs around the conference table. Victoria's attorneys are still pushing for a plea agreement, but given the severity of the charges and her complete lack of remorse, the prosecution isn't interested in negotiations. "What's Gerald saying?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Gerald's been more cooperative, probably because he's terrified of his pharmaceutical connections and wants federal protection. His testimony has been crucial in establishing the premeditation elements of the case." Helena consulted her notes. "He's confirmed that Victoria approached him about eliminating you and Ethan almost 6 months before the actual attempt, giving them plenty of time to plan methods and contingencies. The idea that Victoria had been planning our deaths for half a year while smiling at family dinners and asking about Ethan's school projects still made my stomach turn. But it also reinforced something I'd learned about predators during my marine biology studies. The most dangerous ones are patient hunters, who study their prey extensively before striking. "Any word on the financial recovery?" Marcus asked, joining us from the adjoining office where he'd been reviewing quarterly conservation reports. As interim CEO and permanent trustee, he'd been working 18-hour days to stabilize the company and reverse the damage Victoria had inflicted on both operations and staff morale. "Better than expected," Helena replied. "We've recovered approximately $2.8 million of the $3.2 million she embezzled, mostly from offshore accounts that Gerald helped us locate. The remaining $400,000 was probably spent on operational expenses for the kidnapping and murder conspiracy. It was strange to think of attempted child murder as having operational expenses, but federal investigators had uncovered evidence that Victoria and Gerald had spent months acquiring equipment, researching locations, and coordinating with criminal contacts who specialized in making people disappear permanently. They'd treated our deaths as a complex business project requiring careful planning and resource allocation. What about the company's operational status? I asked. Stronger than it's been in 2 years, Marcus said with satisfaction. Eliminating the fraudulent expenses has freed up significant capital for actual marine conservation programs. Employee morale is up dramatically since Victoria's management policies were reversed. And visitor satisfaction scores are the highest they've been since your father was running things directly. Ethan looked up from his dolphin watching. Does that mean we can expand the sea turtle rehabilitation program like Dad wanted to? It means we can do everything Dad wanted to and more. I confirmed. The board approved funding for sea turtle rehabilitation, expanded educational programming, and a new research partnership with the University of California Marine Biology Department. And the shark exhibits are getting upgraded too, Marcus added. New filtration systems, larger habitats, and behavioral enrichment programs that will help our sharks live healthier, more natural lives. The irony wasn't lost on me that the sharks, which had nearly become instruments of Ethan's murder, were now benefiting from improved care funded by money Victoria had tried to steal from their conservation programs. There was something poetically appropriate about her crimes, ultimately resulting in better protection for the animals she'd seen as nothing more than expensive entertainment assets. Speaking of the sharks, Helena said, there's been some media interest in doing a documentary about what happened. Several production companies have reached out about telling the story of how Victoria's attempt to destroy the family business ultimately led to its renaissance. I considered the proposal carefully. Part of me wanted to keep our family's trauma private, to focus on healing and moving forward, rather than relitigating painful memories for public consumption. But another part recognized that our story might serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing profit over purpose, of allowing greed to corrupt institutions dedicated to education and conservation. What do you think, Ethan? I asked. Would you be comfortable with people knowing what happened to us? He was quiet for a moment, still watching the dolphins, but clearly thinking seriously about the question. Will it help other kids who have scary stepmoms? The simplicity of his response broke my heart a little. In his 8-year-old understanding, the primary value of sharing our story would be protecting other children from similar betrayal and violence. He wasn't thinking about public vindication or corporate reputation. He was thinking about kids who might be living with adults who smiled while planning their harm. It might, I said honestly. It might help people recognize warning signs or encourage them to trust their instincts when something feels wrong about family relationships. Then we should do it, Ethan decided with the decisive clarity that had made our father so proud of him. But only if they promise to show the good stuff too, like how the dolphins and sharks are doing better now. Helena made a note. I'll review the proposals and negotiate terms that give us editorial control over how the story is presented. We want to ensure accuracy and sensitivity, especially regarding Ethan's experiences. A soft knock on the boardroom door interrupted our discussion. Dr. Sarah Patel, my former supervisor from the Marine Research Institute, entered with a warm smile and a coffee cup that suggested she'd been working since dawn on the research projects that had brought her to our facility. Sorry to interrupt, she said, but I wanted to update you on the behavioral studies we've been conducting with the sharks since the new enrichment programs were implemented. Good news, I hope? Marcus asked. Remarkable news, Sarah replied, pulling up a tablet with video footage from the shark habitats. The great whites are showing significantly increased natural behaviors since we installed the new current generators and prey simulation systems. Catalina, in particular, is displaying hunting patterns we've never observed in captive environments. She showed us footage of the massive female shark moving through the water with fluid grace, following scent trails and investigating environmental changes with the focused intensity of a wild predator. It was beautiful and slightly terrifying, a reminder of the raw power contained within our carefully maintained artificial ecosystems. "This is exactly what Dad hoped for," I said softly. "Sharks that could teach people about natural behavior rather than just impressive size and scary teeth." "The educational impact has been substantial," Sarah confirmed. "Visitor surveys show dramatic increases in understanding of shark ecology and conservation needs. People are leaving with genuine appreciation for these animals rather than just thrills from proximity to dangerous predators." Ethan moved closer to watch the tablet footage, his face lighting up with the same wonder I remembered seeing in our father's expression when he talked about marine life. "She looks happy," he observed. "Like she's doing what sharks are supposed to do instead of just swimming in circles." "That's a very sophisticated observation," Sarah told him seriously. "Behavioral enrichment is all about giving animals opportunities to express natural behaviors, even in artificial environments." "Will she remember being hurt before she came here?" Ethan asked, echoing a question he'd posed during his first visit back to the shark exhibit after the kidnapping. "Sharks don't process memories the way humans do," Sarah explained gently. "But she's definitely benefiting from the improved environment we've created for her. She's healthier, more active, and more engaged with her surroundings than she's been since arriving at the facility." I watched Ethan absorb this information, seeing him make connections between animal welfare and human healing that most adults would struggle to articulate. His experiences with Victoria had given him an intuitive understanding of how trauma affects behavior, but also how proper care and environmental changes could promote recovery and growth. "Dr. Sarah," he said thoughtfully, "do you think Catalina would want to go back to the ocean if she could?" It was a complex question that went to the heart of captive animal ethics, the kind of philosophical challenge our father had grappled with throughout his career. Sarah considered it carefully before responding. "Catalina was severely injured when she was rescued, and her injuries prevent her from surviving in the wild," she explained. "But we've tried to create an environment where she can live a fulfilled life, while also helping people understand and protect wild sharks." "So she's like a teacher," Ethan concluded. "She teaches people about sharks, so they'll take better care of the ones in the ocean." "Exactly like a teacher," Sarah agreed. "And she's very good at her job." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Agent Torres, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her since the investigation began, but still carrying herself with the alert professionalism that had made me feel safe during those terrifying days when Ethan was missing. She'd become an unexpected friend over the months of preparation for Victoria's trial, someone who understood both the legal complexities of the case and the personal trauma it had inflicted on our family. "I have news about Victoria's sentencing," she announced without preamble. The judge rejected all plea negotiations and imposed the maximum penalty under federal guidelines. 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, plus additional time for financial crimes and conspiracy charges. I felt a complex mix of relief and sadness at the news. Relief, because Victoria would never again have the opportunity to harm Ethan or anyone else's family. Sadness, because someone who'd once been part of our lives, however briefly and deceptively, had chosen a path that led inevitably to spending the rest of her existence in a federal prison cell. "What about appeals?" Helena asked. "Her attorneys will file them automatically, but the evidence is overwhelming and there were no significant procedural errors during the trial," Torres replied. "Between the confession she made during the hostage situation and Gerald's detailed testimony about their conspiracy, there's virtually no chance of overturning the convictions." "So it's really over," Marcus said quietly. "The legal proceedings are over," Torres confirmed. "The healing continues, but you don't have to worry about Victoria ever threatening your family again." Ethan looked up from the shark footage he'd been studying. "Is she sorry for what she did?" Agent Torres considered the question carefully. During the trial, Victoria had maintained her position that her actions were justified business decisions, rather than criminal acts. She'd shown no remorse for attempting to murder 2 children, expressing regret only that her plans had been discovered before she could complete them. "I don't think she understands why what she did was wrong," Torres said gently. "Some people get so focused on what they want that they forget about treating other people with kindness and respect." It was a diplomatically phrased explanation of sociopathic behavior, appropriate for an 8-year-old who was still trying to understand how someone he'd trusted could have tried to kill him. Ethan nodded thoughtfully, filing the information away in whatever mental framework he was developing for making sense of adult behavior and moral complexity. "I'm glad she can't hurt anyone else," he said simply. "But I'm also glad we don't have to think about her anymore." That evening, after the business meetings and legal updates were finished, Ethan and I walked down to the pier behind the Blackwood Oceanarium to watch the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson. The water was calm, reflecting the sky like a mirror that stretched to the horizon where container ships moved like distant islands across the boundary between sea and sky. "Zara," Ethan said, settling beside me on the weathered wooden bench our father had installed years ago for exactly these kinds of contemplative moments, "do you think Dad would be proud of how we handled everything with Victoria?" It was a question I'd been asking myself regularly since the crisis began, wondering whether our father would have approved of the investigation, the confrontation, the legal proceedings that had consumed so much of our energy over the past 8 months. Richard Blackwood had been a man who preferred solving problems through education and patient persuasion rather than dramatic conflict. "I think he'd be proud that we protected each other and the company he built," I said finally, "but I also think he'd be sad that it came to that kind of conflict in the first place. Because he believed everyone could learn to be better if you just taught them the right things?" Something like that. Dad always said that understanding usually solved problems better than fighting, but he also taught me that some problems can't be solved with understanding alone. Ethan was quiet for a while, watching the gentle waves lap against the pier's support pillars and the seabirds diving for fish in the shallow water near shore. A harbor seal surfaced about 50 yards out, regarding us with dark, curious eyes before disappearing back beneath the surface with barely a ripple. "I miss him," Ethan said eventually, "not just because of the scary stuff with Victoria, but because I think he would have liked seeing how the shark program turned out. And the dolphin research. And all the new educational stuff we're doing. He would have loved it," I agreed. "Especially seeing how excited kids get when they learn about marine conservation. That was always his favorite part of running the aquarium." "Do you think Victoria really didn't understand why what she did was wrong? Or was she just pretending not to understand?" The question revealed a level of psychological insight that impressed and worried me in equal measure. Ethan was developing a sophisticated understanding of human deception and moral complexity, skills that would serve him well as an adult, but seemed heavy for someone who should have been primarily concerned with homework and playground friendships. "I think she understood that other people thought it was wrong," I said carefully, "but she'd convinced herself that making money was more important than treating people with respect and kindness." "That's a really dumb thing to convince yourself of." "Yes, it is. But some adults get so focused on what they want that they forget about everything else, including basic right and wrong." "I'm never going to forget about right and wrong," Ethan declared with the absolute certainty that only 8-year-olds can muster. "Even when I'm old enough to run the aquarium by myself, I'm going to remember that the animals and the people are more important than just making money." Quote, "I think you will remember," I said, putting my arm around his shoulders and feeling grateful beyond words that Victoria's attempt to eliminate him had failed so completely. "And I think Dad would be very proud of the person you're becoming." The sun sank below the horizon, painting the water in deeper shades of purple and indigo as the first stars became visible in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, we could hear the distinctive calls of sea lions settling into their nighttime routines on the rocky outcroppings that dotted the coastline. "Zara?" Ethan said sleepily, leaning against my shoulder with the trusting weight of someone who'd survived genuine danger and come through it with his fundamental optimism intact. "Yeah, buddy? I'm glad you figured out that Victoria was lying about everything. And I'm glad you came to save me when she took me to that scary place." "I'm glad too," I said, thinking about how close we'd come to losing everything our father had built, including each other. "And I'm glad we get to keep working together to take care of the animals and teach people about the ocean. Do you think we'll have more adventures?" "I hope any future adventures involve less danger and more discovery," I replied. "Maybe finding new species, or developing better conservation programs, or helping injured marine animals recover and return to the wild." "That sounds like the right kind of adventures for people who run aquariums," Ethan agreed solemnly. As we walked back toward the main building, passing the illuminated exhibits where nocturnal marine life was beginning its evening activities, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this peaceful moment. 8 months ago, I'd been a peripheral figure in my own family's business, systematically marginalized by a woman who was planning to murder both of us for profit. Now I was co-managing a thriving marine conservation organization with my 8-year-old brother, implementing programs that honored our father's vision while building on innovations he never could have imagined. Victoria's attempt to destroy our family had ultimately made us stronger and more committed to the values she'd tried to corrupt. The Blackwood Oceanarium was busier and more successful than it had been in years. But success was measured in terms of educational impact and conservation achievements, rather than just revenue generation. Visitors left with a deeper understanding of marine ecosystems and their role in protecting ocean health. Students participated in research programs that contributed to real scientific knowledge. Injured animals received rehabilitation that allowed many of them to return to their natural habitats. It was everything Richard Blackwood had hoped his life's work would become, built on the foundation he'd established but extended in directions he never could have anticipated. Victoria had tried to reduce it all to profit margins and operational efficiency, but she'd failed to understand the most important truth about conservation work. Its real value can't be measured in dollars and cents. The sharks in their upgraded habitats continued their eternal patrols, magnificent predators whose presence inspired both awe and respect in the thousands of people who observed them each month. They had no awareness of the human drama that had played out around their environment, no understanding of how close they'd come to being reduced from conservation ambassadors to mere entertainment assets. But they were thriving under the improved care protocols we'd implemented, displaying natural behaviors and contributing to research that would benefit their wild counterparts throughout the world's oceans. In their own way, they were part of the justice that had emerged from Victoria's crimes. The transformation of intended destruction into renewed purpose and stronger protection for vulnerable life. As I tucked Ethan into bed that night, he asked one final question that stayed with me long after he'd fallen asleep. Zara, do you think forgiveness means pretending that bad things didn't happen, or does it mean something else? It was a profound question for anyone, but especially for someone who'd survived attempted murder by a trusted family member. I thought about Victoria in her federal prison cell, serving 4 consecutive life sentences for crimes she still didn't believe were morally wrong. I thought about the trauma counseling sessions, the legal proceedings, the months of rebuilding trust and security that would probably continue for years. I think forgiveness means letting go of anger so it doesn't poison your own life, I said finally. But it doesn't mean pretending that bad things didn't happen or that people who hurt others shouldn't face consequences for their choices. So we can forgive Victoria but still be glad she can't hurt anyone else? I think that's exactly right. We can choose not to carry anger around with us every day, but we can also be grateful that justice was served and other families are protected from what she might have done to them. Ethan nodded thoughtfully, then yawned and settled deeper into his pillow. I love you, Zara. Thank you for saving me and for helping me understand all the complicated stuff. I love you too, buddy. Sweet dreams. 6 months later, I stood once again in the Great White Shark Observatory, this time surrounded by a group of marine biology students from UC Santa Cruz who were participating in our new internship program. They watched with rapt attention as Catalina glided through the crystal-clear water, her movements tracked by sensors that fed data to research computers monitoring everything from swimming patterns to stress indicators. What you're observing, I explained to the students, is a perfect example of how proper environmental management can promote natural behaviors, even in artificial habitats. Catalina is displaying hunting sequences, territorial patrols, and social interactions that closely mirror what we see in wild great white populations. One of the students, a young woman who reminded me of myself at that age, raised her hand. Dr. Blackwood, how do you balance the ethical concerns about keeping apex predators in captivity with the educational and conservation benefits of programs like this? It was exactly the kind of thoughtful question our father would have appreciated, the kind of moral complexity that made marine conservation both challenging and rewarding. I considered my answer carefully, aware that these students would be the next generation of scientists and educators responsible for protecting ocean life. Every animal in our care is here because they can't survive in the wild due to injury or circumstances beyond our control, I explained. Our responsibility is to provide them with the highest quality of life possible while maximizing their contribution to conservation education and research. When we do our job right, each animal becomes an ambassador for their species, and a teacher for thousands of people who might never otherwise appreciate the importance of marine conservation. And when you do your job wrong, another student asked, with the directness that made young scientists so valuable in pushing established thinking. When we do our job wrong, we're just keeping animals in expensive prisons for human entertainment, I admitted. That's why constant evaluation and improvement are essential parts of ethical animal care. As the students continued their observations and data collection, I found myself thinking about the circular nature of education and understanding. These young scientists were learning from animals who were themselves teaching lessons about resilience, adaptation, and the complex relationships between human activity and ocean health. Ethan appeared beside me, now 9 years old, and carrying a tablet loaded with behavioral data he'd been collecting as part of his own informal research project. His interest in marine biology had only deepened since Victoria's attempt to kill him, as if surviving that trauma had strengthened his connection to the natural world our father had devoted his life to protecting. The new enrichment protocols are working really well, he reported with scientific seriousness. Catalina's stress indicators are down 15% from last month, and she's spending 60% more time in active hunting behaviors compared to passive swimming. That's excellent data collection, I told him. What do you think is causing the improvement? I think she likes having more complex challenges in her environment. The new current generators and the variable feeding schedule mean she has to work harder for her food, like she would in the ocean. It was a sophisticated analysis from someone who wouldn't be eligible to drive a car for another 7 years, but it was also typical of the way Ethan had thrown himself into understanding every aspect of aquarium operations and marine biology. He'd transformed his trauma into academic passion, channeling his survival instincts into scientific curiosity and conservation commitment. Dr. Blackwood? One of the students called. We're seeing some unusual behavior from the smaller sharks. They seem to be following Catalina's movement patterns more closely than usual. I moved to observe the interaction she was describing, noting the way the 2 smaller sharks were indeed shadowing Catalina's movements through the water. It was the kind of social behavior that scientists were only beginning to understand in wild shark populations, made possible by the improved habitat conditions that allowed for more natural social dynamics. This is exactly the kind of observation that contributes to our understanding of shark ecology, I told the students. 6 months ago, these animals were showing stress behaviors and artificial movement patterns. Today, they're displaying social interactions that mirror wild populations. What changed? The first student asked. Better environmental design, improved feeding protocols, and recognition that even apex predators have complex social and psychological needs, I explained. We learned to prioritize animal welfare over operational convenience, and the results speak for themselves. As the afternoon session concluded and the students began packing their research equipment, Ethan and I climbed to the observation deck that overlooked the entire aquarium complex. The facility bustled with activity as afternoon visitors moved between exhibits, families gathered around touch tanks, and school groups participated in educational programs. It was everything our father had envisioned when he'd first imagined building a place where people could connect with marine life and learn to care about ocean conservation. But it was also something more. A living testament to the power of choosing education over exploitation, conservation over profit maximization, and family loyalty over personal gain. Zara, Ethan said, settling beside me on the bench where we'd shared so many conversations about marine biology, family history, and the responsibilities that came with inheriting something precious and fragile. Do you ever wonder what Victoria thinks about when she's in prison? It was a question I'd been avoiding for months, trying to focus on healing and growth rather than dwelling on the woman who'd tried to destroy everything we cared about. But Ethan's curiosity was genuine and deserved a thoughtful response. I think she probably still believes she was making rational business decisions. I said honestly. People who hurt others for money usually find ways to justify their choices, even when everyone else can see that what they did was wrong. That's sad, Ethan observed. Not sad like I feel sorry for her, but sad like it's a waste of a person who could have chosen to be good instead. His moral clarity continued to amaze me. At 9 years old, he could distinguish between empathy for human potential and accountability for human choices, understanding that Victoria's imprisonment was both necessary and tragic in its own way. I think Dad would say that everyone has the capacity for good, but not everyone chooses to develop that capacity, I replied. Victoria chose money and power over kindness and respect for other people's lives. And we chose to keep Dad's dream alive instead of letting her destroy it. We chose to honor his values while building something even better than what he originally imagined. Quote, "The sun was beginning to set over Monterey Bay, painting the water in familiar shades of gold and amber, while seabirds performed their evening dance above the waves. In the distance, a small pod of whales was making its way north, along the migration route that brought dozens of species past our coastline throughout the year." "Ethan," I said, "there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you about the future of Pacific Marine Enterprises." He looked at me with the serious attention he reserved for important conversations. "Are we in trouble with money or something?" "No, we're doing very well financially. But I've been thinking about long-term planning, about making sure the company continues to honor Dad's vision, even as we both get older, and our responsibilities change." "You mean like when I go to college and you want to do other marine biology stuff?" "Something like that. I want to establish a formal structure that ensures Pacific Marine Enterprises will always prioritize conservation and education over profit, no matter who's running it or what pressures they might face from investors or board members." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Like a promise we make that can't be broken, even if we're not here to keep it ourselves." "Exactly. A legal commitment to marine conservation that becomes part of the company's fundamental structure, impossible to change without destroying the organization itself." That sounds like a good way to honor Dad's memory and protect all the animals we take care of. It would also protect future families from going through what we went through with Victoria. No one would be able to take over the company and change its mission for personal gain. As the stars became visible in the darkening sky above the Pacific, I felt a sense of completion that had been missing since our father's death. The crisis Victoria had created had forced us to examine everything we believed about family, business, and moral responsibility. We'd emerged stronger and more committed to the values that made our work meaningful. The Blackwood Oceanarium would continue to thrive as a center for marine conservation and education, protected by legal structures that prevented future exploitation while enabling continued growth and innovation. The animals in our care would benefit from continuously improving welfare standards and enrichment programs that honored their intelligence and natural behaviors. And somewhere in the depths of the Pacific, wild sharks continued their ancient migrations, unaware that their captive relatives were serving as ambassadors for ocean conservation and teachers for a new generation of marine scientists who would dedicate their careers to protecting the mysterious world beneath the waves. Victoria Sterling had tried to reduce all of this to a balance sheet, but she'd failed to understand the most important truth about conservation work. Its real value lies not in what it costs or what it earns, but in what it preserves for future generations, and what it teaches about the interconnected nature of all life on Earth. The ocean keeps its own accounts, measuring success in terms of species preserved, habitats protected, and young minds inspired to care about the natural world. By those measures, Pacific Marine Enterprises was thriving beyond anything our father could have imagined, built on the foundation he'd established, but extended in directions that honored both his vision and the lessons we'd learned from surviving Victoria's betrayal. As Ethan and I walked home through the gentle evening air, past exhibits where nocturnal marine life was beginning its nighttime activities, I felt grateful for the strange journey that had brought us to this peaceful moment. We'd started as a family torn apart by greed and deception, but we'd emerged as partners in something larger and more important than either of us could have achieved alone. The sharks would continue their eternal patrols, magnificent predators whose presence reminded every visitor of the power and mystery that still existed in the natural world. And we would continue our work as their guardians and interpreters, translating the language of the ocean for land-dwelling humans who needed to understand their connection to the sea. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.